Hey there, and welcome back. If you are lying in the dark now, with the day behind you and the house gone still, then you have come to the right place, and there is nothing more for you to do tonight but breathe and let the world grow soft, and let me carry you somewhere far away. Tonight we are going back to England, more than 500 years ago, into the long and tangled story of the greatest civil war the kingdom ever fought against itself. A war that ran for 30 years and more, that pulled down monarchs and raised them up again, that set cousin against cousin and brother against brother until the whole noble world of England had torn itself half to pieces. It is a story of two royal houses sprung from the same root, of a red rose and a white, of a gentle king who could not rule, and a fierce queen who fought like a wolf to save his crown, of a mighty earl who made kings and then unmade them, of a golden young warrior who seized the throne, and a dark winter king who lost it on a field at the very end. It is a story of the wheel of fortune turning and turning, lifting men to the summit of the world and casting them down into the mud and the blood, of heads set upon the gates of cities, of two children who walked into a tower one summer and were never seen alive again. And it is in the end the true story behind so many of the tales we tell ourselves even now about crowns and thrones and the terrible price of wanting them. For nothing any storyteller has ever invented is stranger or sadder or more astonishing than what really happened in England in those 30 years of Cousins' War. Tonight we are going to live through all of it, slowly, from the quiet beginning to the bloody end, and there is no need to hold any of it in your head. For the names and the battles and the turning fortunes will wash over you like a tide, and somewhere in the telling you will drift away into sleep. And that is exactly as it should be. Before we set out along that long road, let me say one quiet thing to you. The one who has chosen to spend these hours here in the dark with me, rather than anywhere else you might have gone. If you find, somewhere along the way tonight, that this telling has done what it came to do, that it has lifted you out of your own day and carried you down towards sleep, then you would be most welcome to stay a while in this company, to let this be a place you come back to on the nights when the dark comes early and rest is hard to find. There is a small and simple way to do that, with the button beneath this, and it asks nothing of you and only lets me know you would like to find your way back here again. And if you have a moment before you drift, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you lie, the city or the village or the quiet country dark, the rain or the snow or the warm still air, for these messages reach me from every corner of the earth, from people lying just as you are lying now, and I look through them, every one, and they are among the truest pleasures of these long nights. But all of that can wait. For now there is only the kingdom, and the gathering storm, and the long road down into the war. So picture this. It is the middle of the 15th century, and on the surface, England is a kingdom at peace, a green and prosperous land of walled towns and grey stone castles, of wide fields and slow rivers, and great cathedrals rising over huddled roofs. A country that has spent 100 years sending its armies across the sea to make war upon France, and that has come home now. At last, weary and beaten, the long foreign war, all but lost. The roads are busy with carts and pilgrims and the trains of great lords riding from manor to manor with their liveried men behind them. It is worth pausing to feel the shape of that world, for it is the stage on which everything will happen, and it is very far from our own. This is a land of perhaps 2 or 3 million souls, most of them living and dying within a few miles of where they were born, working the land in the old way, bound to their lords and their parish and the turning of the seasons. Over them sits a steep and rigid order of rank, from the labourer in the field up through the yeoman and the gentleman and the knight to the powerful lords, and at the very summit, the monarch, every man in his appointed place. The whole of society held together by ties of loyalty and service and blood. Power does not rest, as it does in our age. in offices and institutions, but in persons and families, in the foremost lords who hold the land and command the men, each of them with his own following of armed retainers, wearing his badge, his own private strength that he lends to the king in war, and that he can, if he chooses, turn against him. It is worth understanding this system of private power, for it was the very machinery that made the war possible. A great lord did not command his men through any office of the state, but bound them to himself personally by giving them his livery, the coat or the badge that marked them as his, and his maintenance, his protection and favour in their affairs, in return for their service and their swords. A man who wore a leading lord's badge was his, ready to ride at his summons, to fight in his quarrels, to back him in the law courts and on the field. And a powerful lord might have hundreds or thousands of such retainers. A private army gathered around his person by these personal bonds. The badges themselves became famous, the signs by which men knew which lord a body of armed men served, and the houses at the heart of our story, each had their own. The white rose that the House of York took for its sign, and the other emblems, the bear and staff of the kingmaker, the sun in splendour of the golden Edward, that men learned to know and to fear. The red rose of Lancaster, it must be said, was less a thing of the war itself than a sign that a later age fixed upon to set against the white. But the roses, red and white, have given the whole long quarrel its name. The Wars of the Roses, the badges become the title of the war. And the system that the badges served, this binding of private armies to eminent lords, was the deep cause beneath all the particular quarrels, for so long as the mightiest subjects could raise their own armies, the crown could never be safe from them. And the war was at bottom the terrible harvest of a kingdom in which power had drained away from the throne and into the private hands of the overmighty great. There is no standing royal army, no police, no machinery of state as we would know it. The monarch rules through the great lords, and so long as the mighty lords are content and loyal the realm holds, and when they fall to quarrelling, there is nothing to stop them but each other. It is a world that runs on personal loyalty and personal honour and personal violence. A society of immense private power in the hands of a few mighty families, and it is, for all its bells and its prayers and its pageantry, a kingdom only ever one quarrel away from the sword. Hold that picture in your mind as we go on, the steep and rigid order, the powerful lords with their private armies, the sovereign at the top of a structure held together by nothing stronger than loyalty, and you will understand how, when the loyalty failed, the whole of it could come crashing down. The church bells ring the hours over the fields, and in his palace at Westminster sits the king, a gentle, pious, unworldly young man named Henry, the 6th King of England, to bear that name, the grandson of a conqueror, who wants nothing in all the world so much as to be left in peace to pray. He does not know, this gentle king, and nor does anyone in his quiet, prosperous kingdom, that the ground beneath them is rotten, that the peace is a thin crust over a pit of rivalries and grievances and royal blood with too many claimants, and that within a few short years it will all give way, and the whole glittering noble world of England will come crashing down into the longest and most terrible quarrel in its history. To understand how it happened, we have to go back, before this gentle king, before the peace, to an old wound that was never healed, a stolen crown 2 generations before, and it is there, with that first great theft, that the whole long tragedy begins. The stolen crown belonged, by right, to a monarch named Richard, the second of that name, who had ruled England in the years before our gentle Henry was born. He was a strange and a wilful king, proud and suspicious, who quarrelled bitterly with the mighty lords of his realm, and in the end he pushed them too far. For there was among those lords a cousin of his own, a bold and capable man named Henry of Lancaster, the son of the mightiest nobleman in the kingdom. And the ruler, fearing him, drove him into exile, and then, when the old duke, his father, died, seized the whole vast Lancastrian inheritance that should have passed to the exiled son. It was an act of folly as much as injustice, for it left the most powerful young lord in England an exile with nothing left to lose. And Henry of Lancaster did the thing that such a man will do. He came home at the head of a small force, declaring that he sought only his stolen lands, and the kingdom rose to him, and the hated king was deserted on every side. And within a few short weeks, Henry held the realm in his hand. And then he reached past his inheritance and took the crown itself. King Richard was forced from his throne, shut away in a northern castle, and died there soon after, quietly done away with. Once he was no longer of any use alive, and Henry of Lancaster was crowned king in his place, the fourth king of England to bear that name, the first king of the House of Lancaster. To understand why this single act poisoned the next 3 generations, you must understand how the men of that age thought about kingship, for they did not think of it as we do. A king, to them, was not merely the most powerful man in the land, but a sacred figure, anointed with holy oil at his crowning, set apart and made almost priestly, God's own chosen ruler over the realm, to whom obedience was owed as a religious duty. To rise against an anointed king was not only treason, but something close to sacrilege, a sin against the very order that God had set in the world. And the right to that sacred office passed by blood, by strict descent, from father to son, and down the appointed line, so that there was, in theory, always one man and one man only, who was the true and rightful king, marked out by his birth, chosen by God through the accident of his blood. This was the order that Henry of Lancaster broke. By setting aside the anointed king and taking the crown by force, he had done a thing that the whole framework of the age said could not rightly be done. And worse, he had shown that it could be done. That a determined man with enough swords behind him could pull down God's anointed and make himself king in his place. Once that had been shown, it could not be unshown. The sacred mystery of kingship was cracked, the strict line of right broken, and the terrible new idea let loose into the world that the crown might go not to the man with the best blood, but to the man with the strongest arm. For as long as Lancaster ruled in strength, the realm looked away from what had been done. But the broken right and the dangerous example lay there beneath everything, waiting, and when a weak Lancastrian king at last sat the stolen throne, the men with better blood would remember that a crown could be taken, and would reach to take it back. It seemed, at the time, a triumph. But it was the original wound of everything that followed, the theft from which the whole long war would one day grow. And the reason is a matter of blood and right that we must understand, for it is the engine of the entire tragedy. The old King Edward, 2 generations before, the powerful warrior king who had won such glory in France, had left behind him not one heir, but a whole brood of sons. And from those many sons there sprang many lines of royal blood, each with its own place in the order of succession, each carrying the right to the throne in its veins. Henry of Lancaster, who seized the crown, was descended from one of those sons. But he was not descended from the eldest of the lines that came after the senior one, and there were other men, other cousins, whose blood ran nearer to the old true line of succession than his did. By taking the crown by force, by setting aside the strict order of right in favour of the strongest sword, Henry of Lancaster had opened a question that could never afterward be closed, the question of who truly ought to be king. And so long as the House of Lancaster ruled strongly and well, the question slept. But it did not die. It waited, in the blood of the other cousins, for the day when a Lancastrian king should prove too weak to hold what his grandfather had stolen. And that day, though no one yet knew it, was coming. For a time, though, the House of Lancaster ruled in glory, and it seemed the old theft might be forgotten in the blaze of its success. The first Henry held the throne he had taken, through rebellion and trouble, and passed it to his son, and that son was the most dazzling king England had seen in 100 years. He was the fifth Henry the Warrior King, and he took the half-finished war with France and carried it to a height of triumph that astonished all of Christendom. He led his army across the sea and met the whole chivalry of France on a muddy field at a place called Agincourt. And there, outnumbered and exhausted and far from home, his men cut the flower of French knighthood to pieces in an afternoon. The most famous victory in all the long history of English arms. The weapon that won that day, and the wars of that whole age, was the English longbow, and it is worth understanding, for it shaped the very battles of the war to come. It was a simple thing, a tall stave of yew as long as a man, but in the hands of the English yeoman who had trained with it since boyhood, it was the most terrible missile weapon in the world. Able to send a heavy arrow through armour at a distance, and to do it so fast that a body of archers could fill the sky with a falling storm of shafts. A dark rain coming down on the enemy, thick enough to blot out the light. At Agincourt, the proud French knights, mounted and armoured and contemptuous, charged across a muddy field straight into that storm, and were shot down and bogged down and piled up in the mud in a helpless ruin. The cream of French chivalry destroyed by common bowmen, and the young English king won a victory so complete and so glorious that it rang through all of Europe and made his name immortal. It was the high summer of the House of Lancaster, the stolen crown blazing with a glory that seemed to silence every question of how it had been won. But the same deadly bows that won at Agincourt would, within 2 generations, be turned by Englishmen against Englishmen. The storm of arrows falling not on French knights, but on English lords, in the snow at Towton and the fog at Barnet. And the skill that had built an empire abroad would be spent, in the end, in the bloody business of England tearing itself apart. The men who did that bloody business, the armoured fighters at the heart of every battle, are worth picturing as they really were, for the knight of the storybooks, gleaming and gallant on his charger, is only half the truth. The great men and the better sort of soldier went to war encased in plate armour, the finest of it, a marvel of the smith's craft, a whole suit of fitted steel that covered a man from head to foot, jointed so cunningly that he could move and fight in it, and so well made that it could turn a sword stroke or an arrow. A man in full harness was very hard to kill while he kept his feet, a walking fortress of steel, and the battles were in part a matter of these armoured men hammering at one another with sword and axe and the heavy pole weapons made for the purpose, seeking the gaps and joints in the harness, trying to beat one another off their feet. For a man once down in the press, in all that weight of steel, was in deadly danger, unable to rise, to be finished where he lay. It was exhausting, terrifying, deafening work, fought close and personal in a crush of bodies, in the heat and the dark of a closed helmet, hour upon hour, and it took a hard and a trained man to do it. And around these armoured fighters swirled the common soldiers, the billmen and the archers, less protected, more numerous, who did much of the killing and most of the dying. To be in a battle of the roses was to be in one of these heaving, screaming, exhausting slaughters, and to understand the war you must remember that every clash of the foremost names was on the ground, a matter of frightened men in steel hacking at one another in the mud until one side broke. And yet for all the mud and the terror, there was a strange formality to these battles too, a frame of ceremony and custom around the savagery that is part of what made that world so different from our own. The armies went to war under their banners and their badges, a forest of bright heraldry, every leading lord with his own coat of arms and his own standard, so that the field was a blaze of colour. The leaders known by the devices on their banners and the badges on their men. There were heralds, the strange officers of that age, men learned in the law of arms, whose persons were sacred even in war, who carried challenges and parleys between the armies, who knew every coat of arms in the kingdom, and could name the great dead by the devices on their battered shields. and who walked the field after the battle to record who had fallen. There were trumpets and the formal ordering of the host into its battles, the vanguard and the main and the rear, the careful drawing up of the lines. There was the old language of chivalry, of honour and challenge, and the rules of war, draped over the killing like a rich cloth over a butcher's block. Much of it, by the end, was hollow, the chivalry worn thin by the blood feuds and the slaughters, the rules broken as often as kept. But it was still there. The bright banners and the sacred heralds, and the forms of honour, the last gleam of the medieval idea of war as a noble and ordered thing, even as that idea died in the mud and the no-quarter killing of the roses. To picture a battle of the war truly, you must hold both things together, the blaze of heraldry and the burial pits, the sacred heralds and the drag from the altar dead, the forms of chivalry and the savagery they could no longer contain. He went on from there to conquer, until he had brought the proud kingdom of France to its knees, and had himself named the heir to its very throne, married to a French princess, his son to be king of both realms at once. It was the summit of the House of Lancaster, the stolen crown blazing now, with a glory that seemed to wash away all question of how it had been won. The warrior king, the master of two kingdoms, the future bright before him. And then, at the very height of it, with everything won, he died. A camp sickness took him. Suddenly, in France, in the prime of his life, the unconquered conqueror struck down, not by any enemy sword, but by the flux of the camp, and the dazzling reign was over almost before it had begun, and the crown of two kingdoms passed, in an instant, to his only son. His only son was a baby of 9 months old. A child king was in that age very nearly a contradiction in terms, for the whole point of a king was to rule, to lead the armies and master the lords and hold the realm together by the force of his own person. And a baby could do none of these things. When a ruler died, leaving a grown and capable heir, the crown passed smoothly and the realm went on. But when he left an infant, the kingdom entered a long and dangerous twilight, for someone had to govern in the child's name through all the years of his growing, and that someone held a power that was not truly his, that he must one day give up. And around that hollow at the centre, the eminent lords gathered and schemed and quarrelled for advantage. The minority of this particular child lasted not a few years, but the better part of 2 decades, a whole generation in which England was governed by councils of squabbling lords and royal uncles, each pursuing his own ambitions in the royal name. The mighty families growing in power and growing in their rivalries, while the throne at the centre stood empty of any real master. And when the child at last grew up, he proved no master either, so that the kingdom passed from a hollow throne in the cradle to a hollow throne on the seat, never, in all those long years, knowing the firm hand of a real king. By the time the gentle Henry came to his troubled manhood, the lords had grown used to ruling, used to their own power and their own quarrels, and the habit of strong kingship. The thing that alone could have held them in check had been lost. The long minority had taught the nobility of England that the crown could be weak, that power lay with the great families and not with the man who wore the crown, and that lesson, once learned, was the seedbed of the war. Here was the catastrophe folded into the triumph, the worm at the heart of the Lancastrian glory, that the powerful warrior king died young and left his stolen blazing crown to an infant in the cradle. A child who would have to grow up to hold 2 kingdoms, and the loyalty of a proud and quarrelsome nobility, and the unhealed question of his family's right to rule, all of it on his single small head. And the child, when he grew, proved utterly unequal to the task. He became our gentle King Henry, the 6th of that name, and he was, by every account, a good and kindly and pious man, gentle to a fault, more suited to a monastery than a throne, with no taste for war and no head for politics and no force of will whatsoever to master the hard, ambitious men around him. The conqueror's son was a lamb where his father had been a lion, and into his soft and well-meaning hands fell the hardest inheritance in Christendom: 2 crowns and a stolen throne, and a nobility spoiling for a quarrel. At the worst possible moment. Just as the long war in France began at last to turn, and all the glory his father had won began, year by year, to slip away. Picture England then, in the years of this gentle king's manhood, a realm sliding slowly toward ruin while its master prayed. The great conquests in France fell away one by one, towns and provinces lost, the armies starved of money and leadership, until at last the whole vast inheritance his father had won was gone, all of it, save a single port. And England came home from 100 years of war, beaten and humiliated and bitterly poor. And a kingdom that loses a great war turns upon itself. The loss of France was a wound to the whole nation's pride, and it bred a bitterness that ran from the lowest to the highest. For 100 years the English had been the terror of France, the victors of Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, and the war had been not only a matter of glory but of profit, of plunder and ransom and conquered land that had enriched a whole generation of soldiers and lords. Now it was all slipping away, province after province lost, the armies beaten and unpaid, the soldiers trickling home defeated and bitter, with nothing to show for their years of fighting but their scars. These were dangerous men to have loose in a discontented kingdom, hardened fighters with no war to fight and no living to make, and many of them drifted into the private armies of the mighty lords, swelling the followings that would soon take the field against each other. And the common people, who had paid for the long war in taxes and blood, were bitter too, and their bitterness boiled over more than once into open revolt. Risings of the commons against the hated government and its grasping favourites. Men, marching on London with their grievances and their demands, put down with the usual harshness, but leaving the sense, each time, that the realm was coming apart at the seams. The mood of the country in those years was ugly and fearful and full of blame, a kingdom that had lost a vast war and could not understand why, looking about for someone to punish for it, and finding, at the top, a gentle king who could not rule, and a circle of favourites who had lost the war and grown rich while doing it. Into that poisoned mood, the great lords brought their quarrels, and it was tinder waiting for a spark. The soldiers came home with nothing, the treasury was empty, the taxes bit hard, and across the country there spread a deep and dangerous discontent, a sense that the realm was being misgoverned, that something at the very top had gone rotten. The gentle Henry could not master it. He let the government fall into the hands of a narrow circle of favourites, grasping men who enriched themselves and lost the war and were hated by the country for both. And around the throne there gathered the poison of faction. The powerful lords dividing into rival parties, each accusing the other of ruining the realm, each reaching for the sovereign's ear and the king's favour and the spoils that came with them. The hatred of these favourites ran deep and wide, and it boiled over, more than once, into open revolt of the common people, who blamed the monarch's grasping ministers for the lost war, the heavy taxes, the corruption of justice, and the general misery of the realm. The chief of the favourites, the man most hated as the architect of the kingdom's ruin, was seized by his enemies and put to death. His head struck off over the side of a boat, and his body cast up on a beach, a grim sign of how far the fury had risen. And in the heart of the kingdom there came a mighty rising of the common people of the south, tens of thousands of them, marching on the capital under a captain whose name became a byword, with a list of grievances against the misgovernment of the realm, demanding the punishment of the corrupt favourites and the reform of the rotten royal council. They held the city for a time, and some of the hated ministers were dragged out and killed, before the rising was at last put down with promises and pardons that were not kept. These were not yet the Wars of the Roses, but they were the rumble before the storm, the proof that the kingdom under its gentle king had grown so misgoverned, so poor, so angry, that the common people themselves were rising in their thousands, and that the whole rotten structure was ready to come down. Into that seething discontent, the great Duke of York would step, claiming to stand for reform and good government against the hated favourites, and the anger of the realm would become a weapon in the quarrel of the princes. The crust over the pit was cracking, and the gentle monarch, praying in his chapel, dreaming of founding colleges and saving souls, had neither the will nor the wit to hold it together. To understand what came next, you must know the foremost families who were the players in this game, the mighty houses whose rivalries would become the war. For this was not a struggle of common men, but a quarrel at the very summit of the world, among a few dozen families of immense wealth and royal or near-royal blood, all of them tangled together by marriage and descent into one great feuding cousinhood. And that word, cousinhood, is the key to the whole strange tragedy, for the men who fought this war to the death were almost all of them kin to one another, bound together in a single vast family by generations of intermarriage among the great houses. The Duke of York and the gentle king were cousins. The kingmaker was cousin to half the lords on both sides. The leading families had married and remarried into one another for so long that the whole nobility of England was really one enormous quarrelsome family. And the war, for all its talk of houses and roses, was at bottom a family feud, the bloodiest in history, fought out among cousins over the inheritance of a grandfather's stolen crown. This is part of what gives the war its peculiar horror, that it was not a clash of strangers or of nations, but of kinsmen, men who had sat at the same feasts and married the same families and stood godfather to one another's children, now hunting one another across the kingdom and killing one another in the field and on the block. And it is part, too, of what gives it its peculiar fascination, for the rivalries that drove it were not the cold calculations of states, but the hot and personal hatreds of a family at war with itself. The envies and the grudges and the blood feuds of cousins, played out on the grandest possible stage, with the crown of England as the prize. To follow the war is to follow a single tangled family as it tears itself to pieces across 3 generations, and the deeper you go into it, the more you see that almost every great blow struck in it was struck by one cousin against another. At the centre stood the royal house itself, the House of Lancaster, the gentle sovereign and the small circle of his Beaufort kin and his favourites, holders of the stolen crown. Those Beaufort kin of the king deserve a moment's notice, for though they seem a minor branch, they would carry, in the end, the whole future of their house. They were the descendants of an old love, the children that the great founding Duke of Lancaster had fathered upon the woman he loved outside his marriage, born outside wedlock, and then, when at last he married her, made lawful by a special grant, legitimized and raised to the nobility. But there had been a condition fixed upon that legitimizing, a clause that barred this love-born line forever from any claim to the throne, lawful in all things save that one, the crown held just beyond their reach. Through the long years of the war, the Beauforts were among the staunchest of the Lancastrian party, the sovereign's loyal cousins, fighting and dying for the Red Rose through battle after battle, their numbers thinned by the slaughter as the war ground on. And from this barred and love-born branch, when every other line of Lancaster had been cut down, would come at the last the thin thread of blood that carried the cause to its final unlooked-for victory, for it was the Beaufort blood, passed down through a determined mother to an exiled son, that would return at the end to claim the throne and found a new royal house. They were, in the beginning, only the king's lesser cousins, a side branch with a crown forbidden them. They would prove, in the end, the seed from which the whole future grew, and ranged against them, though not yet in open war, stood the man whose blood gave him the strongest rival claim of all, an eminent prince named Richard, the Duke of York. He was the monarch's cousin, immensely rich, descended through both his parents from the sons of old King Edward, his royal blood arguably nearer the true line than the reigning monarch's own, and he was everything gentle. Henry was not, capable, hard, ambitious. A proven soldier and administrator who looked at the ruin of the realm under the favourites and believed, with reason, that he could govern it far better. He did not, at first, want the crown. He wanted only his rightful place at the head of the sovereign's council, the chief position his blood and ability entitled him to. He is in some ways the hardest of the mighty figures to read, this first great claimant, the man who began the long quarrel. For he was no reckless adventurer, but a sober, capable, deeply aggrieved prince who seems to have been driven to rebellion as much by being shut out as by any naked lust for power. He was immensely rich, the greatest landowner in the kingdom after the crown, and he had served the realm faithfully, governing France and then Ireland in the king's name, doing the hard work of state that the favourites neglected, and he believed, with much justice, that his birth and his wealth and his proven ability entitled him to the chief place in the monarch's councils. Instead, he found himself shut out again and again, passed over for lesser men, his advice ignored, his loyalty repaid with suspicion, watched as a threat rather than valued as the prince he was, and the experience soured in him into a deep and dangerous grievance. He was proud, perhaps too proud, certain of his own rightness, slow to bend, and when at last he reached for power, it was with the conviction of a man claiming only what was justly his and had been wrongly withheld. Whether the crown itself was in his mind from the beginning, or whether it grew there slowly as he was driven step by step toward it, we cannot now know, and perhaps he did not fully know himself. But he was the spark and the first great mover of the whole long tragedy, the aggrieved prince who would not accept being shut out from his rightful place, and his pride and his grievance, meeting the gentle Henry's weakness and the fierce Queen's hatred, lit the fire that would burn for 30 years. But he was shut out, again and again, by the favourites who feared him, and a powerful prince shut out from his rightful place, with the strongest claim in the kingdom running in his veins, is the most dangerous thing a troubled realm can hold. And behind these two great houses stood the families whose swords would decide the quarrel, and chief among them, the mightiest of all the noble houses of England, were the Nevilles. They were a vast and a teeming family, lords of the wild north country, and through a fortunate run of marriages and inheritances, they had risen to a wealth and a power that rivaled the royal house itself. Holders of broad lands and grim castles across the whole of the north, commanders of the loyalty of thousands of hard northern men. The head of one branch was the Earl of Salisbury, a shrewd and powerful old lord, and his son was a young man who would become the most famous nobleman of the entire war, the Earl of Warwick. A man of such wealth and ambition and force of personality that he would, in time, make and unmake rulers with his own hand, and earn from a later age the name by which we know him still, the Kingmaker. The rise of this family is a story in itself, and it shows how the whole dangerous order of the age worked. The Nevilles had climbed to their towering height, not chiefly by war or royal favour, but by the patient art of marriage, generation after generation, wedding their sons and daughters into the greatest and richest families of the land, and gathering, as those families failed of male heirs, inheritance after inheritance into their own hands, until the broad lands and the proud titles of half the north had come to rest with them. The old Earl, the Kingmaker's father, had himself married a great heiress, and so founded the family's fortune, and his son, the Kingmaker, made the most brilliant marriage of all, wedding the heiress of one of the very greatest earldoms in England, and so adding its vast estates to his own, becoming at a stroke the richest subject in the kingdom. It was a quiet, patient, generations-long campaign of advancement by the marriage bed rather than the sword. and it had carried the Nevilles from solid northern gentry to the summit of the realm, a power to rival the crown itself. And it bound them by that same web of marriage to the House of York, for the proud Neville sister had wedded the mighty Duke of York, making the Duke and the Kingmaker brothers by marriage, and knitting the mightiest noble house to the mightiest royal claimant in the bond that would carry both to the throne. So when the quarrel came, it was no accident that the Nevilles stood with York, for they were already one family, joined by the marriages that had made them both great, and the war, at its heart, was the alliance of these two mighty houses against the crown that had shut them out. The Nevilles, by ties of marriage, were bound to the Duke of York, for York had married a Neville, the proud and formidable Cecily, and so the greatest noble family in England was joined to the greatest royal claimant. And when the quarrel came, they would throw their enormous weight behind the House of York. Against them in the north stood their bitter rivals, the ancient family of the Percys, lords of the far border country, who hated the Nevilles with a long and murderous hatred over land and precedence, and who would therefore, when the time came, take the other side and fight for Lancaster. The far north of England, where these two great families had their lands and their power, was a wild and a hard country, the most remote and warlike part of the kingdom. A land of bleak moors and grim grey castles and constant raiding back and forth across the Scottish border. The lords who ruled it were not the soft courtiers of the south, but hard-fighting men, the wardens of the border, who kept great followings of tough fighting tenants, always ready for war. For war was never far away in that country. The Percys had been the lords of the north for generations, an ancient and proud family that thought of the border country as its own, and the rise of the Nevilles, these upstart rivals climbing to a wealth and a power that challenged their own, was to them an unbearable affront. The two families quarrelled over land, over offices, over precedence, over every point where their ambitions met, and the quarrel had hardened over the years into a deep and a murderous feud, a private war of the north that simmered and flared long before the terrible quarrel of the crown began. And when that gathering quarrel came, the two families took opposite sides almost as a matter of course. For if the Nevilles were for York, then the Percys must be for Lancaster, and the other way around, each choosing the side that would let it fight its hated rival, with the law and the crown behind it. So the private feud of the north poured its hatred into the national war, and the two streams ran together, and much of the bloodiest fighting of the whole conflict was beneath the banners of York and Lancaster. Really the old border families settling their own scores. It is a thing to remember about this war, that its great quarrel of crowns was fed and fueled at every turn by the small, fierce private quarrels of the powerful families, and that men killed for the rose who were really killing for the feud. So the bitter private feud of the north, Neville against Percy, fed straight into the great quarrel of the crown, York against Lancaster, and the personal hatreds of a few mighty families became the fault lines along which a whole kingdom would crack. This, then, was the board, and these the pieces, as the middle of the century came on. A gentle king who could not rule. A grasping circle of favourites losing a war and a kingdom. A mighty royal cousin, the Duke of York, shut out from his rightful place and brooding on the wrongs done to him. The vast Neville family and their kingmaker Earl bound to York and hungry for the power that would come with his rise. The Percys and the other northern lords ranged against them, ready to fight for the monarch. And over it all, the old unhealed wound, the stolen crown, the unanswerable question of who truly had the right to rule, waiting only for the weakness at the top to crack the realm wide open. It needed only a spark, a single moment of madness or violence, to set the whole thing alight. And the spark, when it came from the monarch himself, from the gentle praying king, in the form of a catastrophe that no one could have foreseen. For one day, without warning, the mind of Henry VI simply went out, like a candle and left the throne of England empty in all but name. But before we come to the madness, we must meet the one figure at the Lancastrian court who had the steel that the sovereign so utterly lacked, and that was his queen. For the gentle monarch had been married as a young man to a French princess named Margaret of the House of Anjou, and she proved to be everything her husband was not. The match itself had been a thing of controversy from the start, and it fed the discontent that was already gathering against the royal government. She came with no great dowry, this French bride, for she was the daughter of a duke rich in titles but poor in lands, a king on paper of realms he did not truly hold. And instead of bringing wealth to England, the marriage cost it, for as part of the bargain that sealed it, the sovereign's ministers agreed to give back to France certain hard-won English territories, lands that English blood had been spilled to take. When this became known, it was bitterly resented, a sovereign marrying a dowerless bride and paying for the privilege with English conquests. And it was laid at the door of the hated favourites who had arranged it. One more grievance in the swelling list against the misgovernment of the realm. So the queen, who would become the fiercest defender of the crown, arrived already under a shadow, blamed before she had done anything for a marriage that looked, to angry English eyes, like a bad bargain and a surrender. Distrusted as a foreigner and a Frenchwoman in a kingdom that had spent 100 years at war with France. It was an unfair burden to lay on a young bride, and it shaped the hatred that would dog her all her life, for she was marked from the first as the foreign queen who had cost England dear. And yet out of that unpromising beginning grew the most formidable figure the House of Lancaster would ever have. The dowerless foreign bride become the iron will behind the throne, who would give everything she had, in the end, to defend the crown of the kingdom that had never wanted her. Where he was soft, she was hard. Where he was unworldly, she was sharply political. Where he shrank from conflict, she sought it out and fought it to the end. She was beautiful and proud and fiercely intelligent, and from the moment she understood that her husband could not protect his own crown, she set herself to protect it for him with a ferocity that her enemies would call the rage of a wolf. Hers was a hard part to play, and we should pause on it, for she has come down to us through the words of her enemies, and they painted her black. A queen in that age was expected to be gentle and meek and ornamental, to bear her sons and grace the court and leave the ruling to men. And a woman who stepped beyond that, who took up the business of power and politics and war, was a monstrous thing in their eyes. Unnatural, a virago, a she-wolf. And this queen had no choice but to step beyond it, for her husband could not rule, and her enemies meant to destroy her line. And so she did the things a monarch should have done. Raised armies and forged alliances and led her cause through battle after battle. And for doing them, she was hated and slandered as no king ever was, called every foul name, blamed for every cruelty. Her courage twisted into savagery and her resolve into spite. Yet behind the slander, there stands a figure of real and terrible greatness. A woman alone in a man's world, fighting for a husband who could not fight, and a son whose birthright was being stolen. Who would not yield, though her cause was beaten again and again? Who came back from defeat after defeat, and exile after exile, to fight once more. She was, in plain truth, the most formidable leader the House of Lancaster ever had, with more steel in her than all the gentle Lancastrian kings put together. And if she was hard, the world had made her so. Remember her as more than the wolf her enemies named her. Remember her as the one heart at the Lancastrian court that never once, in 20 years of disaster, gave up. She was a foreigner, distrusted by the English for it, blamed for the loss of France and the failures of the court, and she gathered to herself all the hatred that the country felt for the Lancastrian misgovernment. But she was also, when the war came, the truest and most relentless champion the House of Lancaster ever had. the will and the sword behind the throne that her husband could not wield, and she would fight for his crown. And for the rights of the son she bore him, long after lesser hearts had given up the cause for lost. Remember her, this fierce French queen, for when the gentle king fades from the story into his prayers and his madness, it is she who carries the red rose forward, year after bloody year, the woman who would not yield. And the son she bore him was the final piece that made the war certain. For until the Queen gave the king an heir, the Duke of York stood as the natural successor to the throne. The next man in line should the childless king die, and that was a thing he could wait for, patiently, as his right. But then, late in the marriage, the Queen bore a son, a Lancastrian prince, and at a stroke York was pushed back from the succession. His patient hope of inheriting the crown by right snatched away, and the bitter rivalry between the Duke and the Queen, who hated each other with a deep and personal hatred, was sharpened to a killing edge. There were even those, the Queen's enemies, who whispered that the child could not be the gentle sovereign's at all. So strange and sudden was its coming, and the whisper was a poison that spread. The Queen had her heir, the line of Lancaster seemed secured, and York's path to the throne by peaceful right was closed. From now on, if he were ever to have what he believed was his, he would have to take it. The pieces were all in place, and it was just then that the candle of the king's mind went out. It happened without warning. The gentle monarch, never strong in spirit, received some piece of terrible news. The final loss of the last of his father's conquests in France, and his mind simply collapsed beneath it. He fell into a strange and total stupor, a living death, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to recognize his own wife or his own newborn son, sitting motionless and senseless month after month, while the whole government of England waited for a master who would not wake. It was a catastrophe without precedent, an empty throne with a breathing king upon it, and it forced the very crisis that everyone had feared. For someone had to rule while the ruler lay senseless. And there was only one man in the kingdom, with the blood and the standing to do it. Imagine the strangeness and the terror of it for those around him. For more than a year the king sat or lay in his chambers, a living statue, his eyes open but unseeing, unable to speak a word or lift a hand or know a single face, fed and washed and tended like an infant, while the most powerful men in the kingdom came and bowed before him and got no flicker of response. When his own son, the longed-for heir, was brought and laid in his arms, the great hope of his house, the monarch looked at the child and gave no sign that he saw him at all. No word, no glance of recognition, nothing. And the babe was carried away again. It was as though the king had died, but forgotten to stop breathing, a body without a mind upon the throne of England, and the realm was left in an impossible position, governed by a king who could not govern, ruled by a man who could not rule, the whole machinery of state seized up around a senseless centre. Something had to be done, and the doing of it forced open the very quarrel that all the careful balancing had so far held shut. For to govern in the monarch's place was to hold royal power, and there was one man whose blood and standing made him the only possible choice, and he was the Queen's deadliest enemy. So the king's madness handed the rule of England to the Duke of York, and handed the Duke of York his chance, and lit, beneath the frozen surface of the court, the slow fuse that would burn down at last to war. The great lords, even many who feared him, turned to the Duke of York, and made him protector of the realm, the ruler of England in all but name while the sovereign slept. For a year and more York governed, and governed well, the strong hand the kingdom had lacked for so long, and it must have seemed to him that fortune had given him at last, by this strange accident, the place that had always been his by right. But the Queen watched it all with a cold and bitter fury, for she saw in York's protectorate the theft of her son's inheritance and a deadly threat to her husband's crown. And she waited, gathering her strength. for the day the king should wake. And one day, as suddenly as it had gone, the sovereign's mind came back. He woke, gentle and bewildered, knowing nothing of the year that had passed. And the moment he woke, the Queen struck, sweeping York from his protectorate, casting him out of power, restoring the favourites, shutting the foremost duke out once more from the place he had held and believed was his. York had tasted the rule of England, and had it taken from him by the Queen he hated, and now he was cast out, in fear of his life, with his enemies in power and the strongest claim in the kingdom burning in his blood. There was only one road left to him, and so, at last, after all the long years of grievance, the Duke of York raised his banners, and gathered his Neville kin and their hard northern men, and marched toward the ruler, and the realm tipped over, at last into war. The first blood was spilled at a town called St. Albans, north of London, and it was a small and almost accidental affair beside the slaughters that would come later, but it was the beginning. The moment the long quarrel passed from words into killing, the Duke of York and his Neville allies came down upon the town with their armed retainers, and the king and his lords were there with theirs. And after some hours of fruitless talk, the Yorkists attacked. It was less a battle than a brawl in the narrow streets, brief and confused, but in it, the Yorkist swords found and cut down the very men they had come for, the leading lords of the Queen's party, the men York and the Nevilles most hated, including the old enemy of the Nevilles, the head of the rival northern house. It is worth pausing on how small and almost accidental this first clash was, set beside the vast slaughters it would lead to, for it shows how a great war can begin from a little spark. There were no great armies at this first fight, only the armed retinues that the lords kept about them, a few thousand men on either side, and it began not as a planned battle, but as the breakdown of a tense negotiation. The Yorkist lords drawn up outside the town, demanding the surrender of their enemies, the king's party refusing, the hours passing in fruitless parley until patience snapped and the Yorkists forced their way in. The fighting, when it came, was a brief and ugly scramble through the streets and the marketplace, over barricades and through gardens. An hour or two of confused, close combat rather than a battle in the open field. And yet in that brief brawl, the thing was done that could never be undone. For the Yorkists used the chance to hunt down and kill the particular eminent lords they hated, the leaders of the Queen's party, settling their feuds with the sword under cover of the fight. A handful of men died in those streets, no more. A tiny tally beside Towton's thousands. But they were the wrong men to kill, the heads of great families, and their deaths planted the blood feuds that would grow into the whole vast war. So the long and terrible quarrel began almost by accident, in a street brawl in a little town, with a few score dead, and from that small and bloody seed grew 30 years of slaughter. The gentle king himself, caught in the fighting, was wounded in the neck by an arrow and took shelter in a tradesman's house, bewildered, while around him his chief supporters were killed in the streets. And when it was over, the Duke of York knelt before his dazed and wounded king, and professed his loyalty, and took him back into his keeping, and ruled once more in his name. It seemed, for a moment, almost like a return to order, but a terrible thing had been done that could not be undone, for the sons of the lords killed at St. Albans now carried a blood feud against York and the Nevilles, a personal hunger for revenge that would drive them, and the Queen who led them, to ever greater violence. The first blood had been drawn, and blood, once drawn, calls for more. This is the moment to understand a thing that would shape the whole rest of the war, the terrible logic of the blood feud, for it is what turned a political quarrel into a generation of slaughter. In the older fighting between mighty families, and even in the early clashes of this war, there had been a kind of restraint, an understanding that the powerful lords might fight and even kill one another in battle, but would spare the common soldiers, and that a defeated lord might be ransomed or pardoned rather than destroyed. But St. Albans broke something. The Yorkist lords had not merely defeated their enemies there, they had hunted down and killed the particular men they hated, the heads of the rival families, in what looked less like a battle than an execution. And the sons of those dead men were left behind, grown or growing, carrying a burning personal need to avenge their fathers, a blood debt that could be paid only in the blood of the men who had killed them. From that day, the war acquired a savage private momentum that no political settlement could ever quiet. For even when the great quarrel might have been patched up, the sons of the slain would not rest until they had their revenge. And their revenge created new orphans with new debts of blood, on and on, each killing, breeding the next. This is why the war grew crueler as it went, why the early restraint gave way to the slaughter of the great and the killing of prisoners and the heads on the gates, because beneath the quarrel of crowns there ran this deepening river of private vengeance. Cousin avenging cousin, son avenging father, the feud feeding on itself until it had half consumed the nobility of England. Blood called for blood, and the call was answered, again and again, for 30 years. There followed some years of uneasy, treacherous peace, a peace that was really only a gathering of strength, both sides arming, manoeuvring, building their followings, while gentle Henry tried in his helpless way to reconcile his warring lords, and the fierce queen worked tirelessly to destroy her enemy. It could not hold. The hatreds were too deep, the stakes too high, the feud of St. Albans too raw, and at last it broke again into open war, and this time fortune turned hard against the House of York. For the Queen had built up the monarch's party in strength, and when the armies came together, the Yorkist lords found themselves outnumbered and outmanoeuvred, their forces melting away, and rather than be destroyed, they broke and ran. The whole Yorkist cause collapsing in a single bad season. The Duke of York fled across the sea to Ireland, and his son and the Nevilles fled to the continent, and the Queen's party held the field and the monarch and the government. And in the Parliament that followed, they had York and all his allies declared traitors, their lands and their lives forfeit, their cause seemingly broken and finished. It was the lowest point the House of York had yet known. Its leaders scattered and outlawed and in exile, the Red Rose triumphant, the Queen victorious. But fortune's wheel, which had lifted the Queen so high, was already beginning to turn again. For the Yorkist lords in exile were not broken men, but desperate ones, and desperate men with armies and a cause come back. They came back the next year, and the wheel spun hard the other way. The Nevilles and York's eldest son landed in the south, and the country, weary of the Queen's misgovernment, rose to them, and they marched on London and took it, and then met the royal army in the field, and won a great victory, capturing the gentle Henry himself once more, and scattering the Queen's forces. And now the Duke of York, returning at last from Ireland to a kingdom that lay open before him, took the step he had so long held back from. He came to the Parliament, and he walked up to the empty throne, and he laid his hand upon it, claiming the crown of England itself as his by right of blood, the right that ran nearer the true line than the Lancastrian kings. It was the thing he had wanted, perhaps, all along, beneath all his protestations of loyalty, and now he reached for it openly. The scene in the Parliament chamber was one of the most extraordinary of the whole war, and it shows how deep the reverence for the anointed king still ran, even now. The Duke of York came into the hall where the lords were gathered, and he walked up to the empty throne, the great chair of state, with its cloth of gold, and he laid his hand upon it, in the old gesture by which a man claimed a thing as his own. He expected, surely, a roar of acclamation, the lords rising to hail him as their rightful king. Instead, there was silence. A long, cold, appalled silence, the lords staring at him, no man speaking, no man moving to support him. For even those who had followed him to war, who believed his cause just and the king unfit, could not bring themselves to this. To the open deposing of the anointed king, the breaking of the sacred line. The reverence for the crowned and anointed king, broken though it had been by the first usurpation 2 generations before, still held a terrible power over men's minds, and to set it aside in cold blood, in the daylight of the Parliament, was a step that even York's own friends drew back from. He had badly misjudged the moment, and he was forced to retreat from his bold claim into a compromise. The strange bargain that let the gentle monarch keep his crown for life, but made York his heir. It was less than he had reached for, and it satisfied no one, for it left a ruler on the throne whose own party would never accept the disinheriting of his son, and an heir waiting in the wings whom that king's queen was sworn to destroy. The reach for the throne had failed, but it had shown the realm that York meant, in the end, to have the crown, and it made the final war between the houses certain. But even his own supporters were not ready for so naked a stroke, to depose the anointed king outright, and they drew back from it, and a compromise was struck instead, an extraordinary bargain, that the gentle king should keep his crown for his lifetime, but that after his death it should pass not to his own son, but to the Duke of York and the House of York forever. It was a bargain that satisfied no one and could not possibly hold, and everyone who struck it must have known as much in their hearts. For it asked the gentle sovereign to do a thing no king could be expected to do, to disinherit his own son, to set aside the boy he believed his heir, and hand the crown after him to the rival who had hounded him. And though the helpless king, in the power of his enemies, set his name to it, no father's heart could keep such a bargain, and no mother's would. The fierce queen, away in the north with her disinherited son, repudiated it utterly, for it stole from her boy the very birthright she had fought her whole life to secure, and she would no more accept it than she would cut the child's throat herself. So the bargain that was meant to bring peace guaranteed instead the bloodiest phase of the whole war, for it gave the queen no choice but to fight on to destroy it, and it gave the House of York a parchment claim to the throne that it would now defend with the sword. It was in truth less a settlement than a postponement, a piece of paper papering over a chasm, and within weeks of its making, the Queen's immense army was marching south to tear it up, and the Duke of York was riding north to his death to defend it. The strange bargain stands as a perfect emblem of the whole hopeless tangle, an attempt to settle by clever compromise a quarrel that no compromise could settle, because it asked men to give up by agreement the very things, a son's crown, a father's line, that no man will ever give up while he has breath and a sword. It disinherited the Queen's son at a stroke, set York in his place as the heir to England, and it was, for York, in very nearly everything. But it was a thing the fierce Queen could never accept, for it stripped her son of his birthright, and she was not finished, not by a long way. She had fled north with her boy into the wild country where Lancaster was strong, and there she gathered a sweeping army of the hard northern lords, the Percys and their kind, who hated the Nevilles and loved the old cause. And she came south again like a storm, to destroy the Duke of York and tear up the bargain that had stolen her son's crown. And York, hearing she was coming, marched north to meet her in the dead of winter, and it was the last march he would ever make. What happened in the cold country near a castle called Sandal by the town of Wakefield turned the war from a quarrel of lords into something far darker. The Duke of York, for reasons no one has ever fully understood, came out from the safety of his castle walls to give battle to the Queen's far larger army, and he was overwhelmed, his force destroyed, and York himself was killed in the fighting. The great prince who had reached for a crown, cut down in a winter field. It was the fortune of war, and might have been borne. But what the victors did after was something new, a deliberate cruelty meant to terrify, and it broke whatever restraint had so far held the war in check. York's second son, a boy of 17, was taken in the rout as he fled and killed in cold blood. A child of the royal house put to death after the battle was won. And then the Queen's men cut the head from the dead duke and set upon it a paper crown, in mockery of the man who had reached for a real one. And they carried the heads of York and his son and his Neville father-in-law to the city of York and set them high upon the gates over the great gateway, the paper crown still on the duke's brow, so that, as they jeered, York could look out over the town that bore his name. The setting of heads upon the gates was an old custom, the traditional fate of the traitor, whose head was struck off and spiked high on the city walls or the bridge gate as a warning to all who passed beneath, left there to rot through the seasons until nothing remained but the bare skull. London Bridge in those years was crowned with a grim gallery of such heads, the remnants of the realm's defeated rebels, gazing blindly out over the river. But to do this to the Duke of York, the sovereign's own cousin, a prince of the blood who had so nearly been king, and to crown his severed head with paper in mockery of his ambition, was a deliberate and a calculated cruelty beyond the common run, meant to shame him utterly in death and to terrify his followers into submission. It had the opposite effect. The sight of those heads on the gates, the paper crown, the murdered boy, did not cow the House of York, but lit in it a cold and a lasting fury, and above all, in the dead Duke's eldest son, the tall young man who was now the heir to all his father's claims and all his father's blood debt. He did not forget the paper crown. When his turn came, and it came soon, he would not be merciful, and the heads of his enemies would go up on the gates in their turn, and the war would grind on into ever deeper cruelty, paid back blow for blow, head for head, until a whole generation of the great had been fed into it. The paper crown was meant to end the House of York. It armed it instead with a hatred that would not rest until Lancaster itself lay in ruins. It was a thing calculated to break the Yorkist spirit forever, the rival claimant dead and mocked, his heir a boy's head rotting on a gate. But it did not break them. It enraged them past, all bearing, and it handed the leadership of the House of York to a young man who would prove a far more dangerous enemy than his father had ever been. For the dead Duke had an eldest son, 18 years old, tall and golden and brilliant in war, and that young man, hearing how his father and his brother had been killed and mocked, did not weep. He gathered an army, and he marched to take the crown his father had died for, and to make the Queen's party pay in full. His name was Edward, and he was, by every account, the most magnificent figure of the entire war. A giant of a man, well over 6 feet tall in an age when that was rare, broad and powerful and beautiful, with a charm that drew men to him and a genius for battle that never once, in all his life, deserted him. One thing that strikes you, looking back across the whole long war, is how young so many of its great figures were. How much of this history of crowns and battles was made by men and women, scarcely more than children by our reckoning. The Golden Edward won his first vast battles and seized his throne at 18. The Lancastrian prince, killed at the war's turning, was a youth of 17. The boy princes, who vanished in the tower, were 12 and 9. A patient mother who schemed a dynasty into being had borne her son at 13 and been widowed in the same year. Again and again the great parts in this drama were played by the very young, thrust by birth and death, and the chances of war into roles of terrible weight, leading armies, claiming crowns, dying on fields and blocks. before they had reached the age we would now think fit for any of it. It was a hard world that asked such things of the young, a world in which a boy of 18 might be a king and a commander, in which children of the great houses were counters in the game of crowns from their cradles, married off and fought over, and killed for the blood in their veins. And it lends the whole story a particular sadness when you hold it in mind that so many of these figures, whose rises and falls we have followed, were so young when the wheel took them up and cast them down. Young men and women and children caught in a quarrel their grandfathers had begun, paying with their brief lives for a crown that had been stolen before they were born. The Wars of the Roses were, among everything else they were, a devourer of the young, and that is a part of what it was really like, that the war fed on its children, generation after generation, until at last it had burned itself out. He was 18 years old when his father died, and within a few short weeks he had won a battle in the West, marched on London, and let himself be proclaimed king. The first king of the House of York, Edward IV, the rightful heir under the bargain, his father had struck, the avenger of Wakefield. He was, in those first years, the most glamorous king England had seen in living memory, and the people adored him. He stood a clear head taller than other men, a true giant for his age, golden-haired and handsome, splendid in his rich clothes. Easy and charming and approachable in a way the cold, gentle old king had never been, mixing freely with the merchants and the people of London, remembering faces and names, dazzling all who met him. London was the mighty prize of the war, the richest and most populous city in the kingdom by far, and whoever held it held something close to the heart of the realm. It was a crowded, teeming, walled city on the river, a place of narrow streets and overhanging houses, and the constant din of trade, dominated by the great bridge crowded with its shops and houses, and at its gate the grim, spiked heads of traitors. And by the White Tower downstream, and by the spire of the old cathedral rising over all. Within the walls lived the merchants and the craftsmen, whose wealth could fund an army, whose loyalty could open or bar the gates to a claimant, whose mood could make or break a cause. And so the city was courted by every side, its favour worth more than many a battle. The Golden King understood this better than anyone, and made himself beloved of the Londoners, the merchants and their wives mixing among them with his easy charm, and the city loved him for it, and backed him with its wealth and its gates. And that backing was worth a great deal to his cause. To win London was very nearly to win the kingdom, for the city that held the wealth and the trade and the symbolic heart of the realm could tip the balance of the whole war. And again, in the long struggle it is to London that the armies march, to be let in or shut out, the great city watching the wheel turn and choosing each time the side it judged most likely to win. And behind the charm was a soldier of genius. For in all the battles of his life, and he fought many, he never once lost. A born commander with an instinct for war that never failed him. Swift and decisive and merciless when he needed to be. He seemed the very image of what a sovereign should be. Everything the realm had longed for through the long, sad years of weakness. A strong young warrior to set the kingdom right. And the country, sick of gentle Henry and the fierce Queen and the endless misgovernment, took him gladly to its heart. For a time it seemed that the Sun King, as his badge of the blazing sun seemed to promise, would heal the broken realm and reign in glory. And he had it in him to do it. The strength and the skill and the charm all together, a great king in the making. But there was a flaw in him too. A streak of self-indulgence and a fatal capacity for trusting the wrong people and following his own desires against all good counsel. And that flaw would, in time, sow the seeds of fresh disaster. For it would lead him into the marriage that broke his alliance with the kingmaker and set the wheel turning once again. But proclaiming was not holding, For the fierce queen and her northern army were still in the field, undefeated, and the gentle old monarch was still in her keeping. And the real reckoning was still to come. The young Yorkist king marched north to find the queen's army and settle the matter once and for all. And the two great hosts, the largest that had ever been gathered in England, the whole divided nobility of the realm, and all their tens of thousands of men, came together at last on a high windswept plateau near a village called Towton, on a freezing Palm Sunday, in a driving snowstorm. And there they fought the largest and the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. It was a slaughter beyond anything the kingdom had seen, fought all through a short winter's day in wind and snow. Two huge armies locked together on the high ground, hour after hour, neither giving way, the dead piling up in drifts. To grasp what such a battle was, you must set aside any notion of the neat clash of the storybooks, and picture instead the reality, which was closer to a long, grinding, exhausting slaughter at arm's length. The two armies came together on foot, the mighty lords dismounting to fight among their men, and the fighting was hand to hand, body pressed against body, men hacking and thrusting at the strangers in front of them, with sword and axe, and the cruel pole weapons of the age, in a press so tight that the dead could not fall, in a din of screaming and clashing metal that went on not for minutes but for hours. There was no skill in it after the first moment, only endurance and butchery, the front ranks killing and dying, while the ranks behind pushed forward over the bodies, the whole heaving mass of it churning slowly across the frozen ground all through the short grey day. And what made this particular battle the most terrible of the war was its sheer scale, for nearly the whole nobility of England was there, with all their tens of thousands of men, the largest armies ever to meet on English soil. And the order had gone out on both sides to give no quarter, to spare no one, so that when at last the Lancastrian line broke, there was no mercy, only the long red business of cutting down the fleeing, hour after hour, across the snow and into the river and over the country beyond. By the end, men said, you could have crossed the river on the bodies. What a battlefield was like after the fighting, when the killing was done and the victors held the ground, is a thing the old chronicles seldom dwell on, but that we should not look away from. For it was the true face of the war beneath all the banners and the glory. The field at evening was a place of horror, strewn with the dead and the dying, the wounded crying for water, or for their mothers, or for a merciful end, the looters already moving among the bodies, stripping the dead of their armour and their clothes and their valuables, for good harness and a fine sword were worth money, and the dead had no more use for them. The powerful lords who had fallen would be sought out and carried off by their families for burial in their own churches, or, if they were the enemy, their heads taken for the gates. But the common dead, the thousands of ordinary men who did most of the dying, were gathered up and tumbled together into great pits dug near the field. A whole army's worth of the slain laid in the cold earth without name or ceremony, and the grass grew over them, and in time the very place of the battle was a quiet field again, with nothing to show the slaughter it had seen, but the long low mounds of the burial pits and the bones that the plough would turn up centuries after. This was the end of every battle in the long war, the cheering and the glory giving way to the burial pits, the wheel that had lifted one side to victory and cast the other into the grave. And it is the truest answer to the question of what it was really like, that beneath all the foremost names and the turning crowns, the war came down, in the end, to young men in burial pits, and the grass growing over them, and the long silence after. It was a wound from which the old nobility of England never fully recovered, a single day's slaughter of the great that thinned the proud families of the realm as no battle before or since. And it bought the tall young king his crown at a price written in the blood of half the lords of England. The snow blew into the faces of the Lancastrians, blinding them, carrying their arrows short, while the Yorkist archers loosed into them and reaped them down. Still they fought all day in the cold and the blood, until at last, late in the afternoon, fresh Yorkist men came onto the field and the Lancastrian line broke, and then the killing became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. The broken army cut down in their thousands as they fled across the snow, drowning in a swollen river, dying in the rout in numbers that no one could truly count. The flower of the Lancastrian north destroyed in a single terrible day. When it was over, the snow was no longer white. The young Yorkist king had won the most complete victory of the war, broken the Queen's great army, and made himself master of the field and the kingdom. The fierce Queen and the gentle old man and their young son fled north and then into exile in Scotland. The cause of Lancaster shattered, the crown of England, after all the long quarrel, in the hands of the House of York at last. The flight into Scotland is a reminder that this was never a wholly private English quarrel, for the leading powers across the seas watched it keenly and meddled in it constantly, and the fortunes of the war turned more than once on foreign help. England did not stand alone in the world, but among rival kingdoms, the old enemy France, the rich trading lands of Burgundy across the narrow sea, the kingdom of the Scots, forever hostile on the northern border, and each of these had its own interest in who ruled England and was glad to see the kingdom weakened by its own divisions. The defeated of one side would flee abroad and beg help of a foreign king, offering, in return for arms and money and shelter, all manner of promises, lands and alliances, and the surrender of English interests. And the foreign powers played the warring houses against each other for their own advantage, backing now this side and now that, prolonging the agony of the kingdom for their own gain. The fierce Queen sought help in Scotland and in France, buying it with promises and with the surrender of English-held places. The kingmaker, in his turn, allied with France against his old master. The Golden Monarch found his refuge and his army among the Burgundians. The crown of England in those years was a thing that foreign sovereigns helped to make and unmake, the divisions of the realm an opportunity its rivals were quick to exploit. And the long war was the more prolonged and the more bitter, because the losers could always flee across the water and come back again with foreign swords behind them. A kingdom divided against itself is a kingdom at the mercy of its neighbours, and England, in the Wars of the Roses, paid that price in full. The wheel had turned all the way over, and for a while it seemed the war was won. For 10 years the young Yorkist king reigned, and for much of that time the realm had something like peace, and the people, weary of the long quarrel, took gladly to their tall golden king who had won his crown in the snow. His court in those years was the most splendid England had seen, and it is worth lingering there a moment in the warmth and the light of it, for the Sun King loved magnificence and surrounded himself with it. Picture the great hall of an evening, the long tables loaded with gold and silver plate that caught the light of 100 candles and the roaring fire. The walls hung with rich tapestries, the company in their furs and velvets and bright silks. For the sovereign set a fashion of display, and his court followed it. There was feasting of many courses, roasted meats and subtleties of spun sugar, shaped like castles and beasts, wine flowing freely, and music in the gallery. And after the meat there might be dancing, or the songs of minstrels, or the telling of tales, the whole hall glowing and murmuring late into the night. The tall king presided over it all in his glory, the handsomest man in the room, by a head, easy and gracious and free, delighting in the beauty and the abundance of his court, a monarch who knew how to enjoy a crown so dearly won. It was a deliberate splendour. This, for a magnificent court, was a kind of power. A show of wealth and confidence that impressed the realm and overawed his rivals, and drew the great families to bask in his light. And it was the reward, too, for all the blood, the warm, bright peace at the centre of the storm. A few golden years in which the kingdom, exhausted by war, could gather around its golden king and feast and forget. It could not last, for the seeds of fresh trouble were already sown. But while it lasted, it was a glory, and it is good to picture it, the bright hall and the candlelight and the tall king in the midst of it, before the dark came down again. He was everything the gentle old king had not been. Strong, decisive, brave, a born ruler and a born soldier, and he set about restoring order to a kingdom that had nearly torn itself apart. And for a while he did it well. But the young monarch had not won his crown alone, and the man who had helped him to it now stood at his shoulder, the mightiest subject in the realm, and expected to be rewarded and heeded accordingly. That man was the Earl of Warwick, the eminent Neville Lord, the head of the family whose swords had carried the House of York to victory, and he was, in these years, very nearly the ruler of England in his own right. So vast was his wealth and his power and his following. Men called him the Kingmaker, for it was his strength as much as anyone's that had set the young king on the throne, and he meant to be the power behind that throne, the great minister and guide of the king he had made, to govern the realm through his royal protégé as a wise old hand guides a young one. He was, in his prime, the most famous man in England after the ruler, and in some ways more famous, more talked of, more courted, more feared. His wealth was almost beyond reckoning. The gathered inheritance of half a dozen great families fallen into his hands by marriage and descent, broad lands in every part of the kingdom, castles past counting, a private income that rivaled the crown's own. And he spent it like water, for he understood that power in that age was built on display and on generosity, and he kept open house on a scale that astonished even that age of terrible households, feeding hundreds at his gates. His kitchens roasting whole oxen, any man who knew him welcome to come and eat his fill, so that his popularity with the common people grew as huge as his fortune. Men loved him for his largesse and his bluff, soldierly manner and his open hand, and thousands wore his badge and would follow him anywhere. And that vast personal following, bought with his vast wealth, was the true foundation of his power, an army of devoted retainers and grateful commons that made him, for a time, mightier than any subject England had ever known. He had the gift, too, of seeming to embody the discontents of the realm, of making his own ambitions look like the cause of the people against bad government, so that when he rebelled, men flocked to him, believing they fought for the right. It was a towering career, built on wealth and generosity, and a genius for popularity, and it carried him to the very mastery of the kingdom, the maker of monarchs. But it rested, in the end, on his own person and his own fortune, and when his luck ran out in the fog at Barnet, the whole vast structure of his power vanished with him in a morning, as such personal empires always do. For a time it worked. But the young sovereign was nobody's puppet, strong-willed and shrewd beneath his easy charm, and as he grew into his kingship, he grew restive under the earl's heavy hand, and began to go his own way. And the seeds of a quarrel were sown between the king and the man who had made him. The quarrel came to a head over a marriage, as so many things in this story do, and it was the young monarch's own marriage that lit the fuse. The kingmaker had been working to wed his royal protégé to a great French princess, a match that would crown the earl's foreign policy and bind England to France and set the seal on his own mastery of the realm. But the young king, it turned out, had other ideas, for he had fallen, suddenly and secretly, for an Englishwoman, a beautiful young widow of no great rank named Elizabeth, of the family of Woodville, a woman with 2 small sons and a horde of ambitious relations, and nothing royal about her at all. And rather than make her his mistress, as a king might, the young sovereign married her secretly for love, and then revealed the marriage to his astonished court, presenting the realm with a low-born queen where the kingmaker had promised it, a French princess. It is hard, across the centuries, to convey how shocking this was, how it broke every rule of how a ruler was supposed to behave. A king's marriage was the single most important act of his reign, a matter of high state, the means by which he forged a great foreign alliance and secured his dynasty, and it was unthinkable that he should spend it on a woman of his own choosing for so frivolous a reason as love. Kings married princesses, the daughters of foreign kings, to win allies and dowries and standing. Their hearts had nothing to do with it, and if they wanted a beautiful Englishwoman, they took her as a mistress and married a princess regardless. For the young monarch to throw away his priceless marriage on an Englishwoman of modest birth, a widow with children, and a swarm of grasping relations, with no dowry and no alliance, and nothing to recommend her but her beauty, was an act of breathtaking folly in the eyes of every statesman in Europe, and a deadly insult to the kingmaker, who had been negotiating the great French match in the king's name, and now learned that the monarch had secretly married someone else and left him looking a fool before all the world. And the insult was compounded daily thereafter, as the new queen's enormous family, the Woodvilles, came crowding up into the court to claim the rewards of their kinswoman's astonishing luck, snapping up the great marriages and the high offices and the rich heiresses, climbing over the heads of the old nobility, gathering to themselves the favour and the prizes that the kingmaker had thought his own. The proud earl who had made this king watched himself displaced by a tribe of upstarts, whose only claim was the monarch's infatuation, and the slow poison of his resentment began to work, and the alliance that had won the throne began, quietly, to die. It was a thunderbolt. The earl was humiliated before all of Europe, his careful match destroyed, his policy overturned, his guidance flung back in his face by the king he had made. And it grew worse, for the new queen's large and grasping family, the Woodvilles, now swarmed up into the heights of the court, taking the great marriages and the high offices and the rich rewards, climbing over the heads of the old nobility, gathering to themselves the favour that the kingmaker believed was his by right. The earl watched this upstart family of the queen's rise and rise, watched them take the prizes he wanted for his own, watched his influence over the sovereign wither as the Woodvilles bloomed, and the proud heart of the kingmaker turned slowly from resentment to fury to something darker still. The man who had made the king began to think about unmaking him. And here is the strange and the terrible turn that shows you the true nature of this war, the way it ground the loyalties of men to nothing in the end. For the kingmaker, the mighty Yorkist lord, the man whose family had bled for the White Rose at St. Albans and Wakefield and Towton, who had set Edward of York upon the throne with his own strength, now turned against that throne and against the ruler he had made, and reached across the whole bloody divide of the war to ally himself with his oldest enemy. He made his peace with the fierce Queen of Lancaster, the woman his family had fought for 20 years, the woman whose cause he had destroyed in the snow at Towton, and he agreed to join his strength to hers. To pull down the Yorkist king he had raised, and to put the gentle old Lancastrian king back on the throne. To seal it, his own daughter was married to the Lancastrian prince, the Queen's son, the very boy whose inheritance the House of York had stolen. It was an alliance that would have seemed insane a few years before. The kingmaker and the she-wolf joined together, White Rose and Red, the maker of the Yorkist king, become the restorer of Lancaster. But such was the war by now that the deepest loyalties could be ground to dust by ambition and grievance. That a man might spend half his life killing for one cause and the other half killing for its enemy, and that nothing, in the end, was certain but the turning of the wheel. The kingmaker had made a king. Now he would unmake him and make another, and prove himself, for one last brief turn of fortune, the true master of the crown of England. The Kingmaker's rebellion swept the young Yorkist king clean off his throne, and for a few months the impossible became real, and Lancaster ruled again. The Earl landed with his forces, the country rose, and the king he had made found himself suddenly without an army, deserted, betrayed even by his own brother, and forced to flee for his life across the sea with a handful of followers. A sovereign one day and a penniless exile the next, leaving his kingdom and his pregnant queen behind him. The brother who betrayed him is a story in himself, and a perfect parable of the war's power to rot the bonds of blood. For the Golden King had two younger brothers, and the elder of them, a vain and a discontented young man, had let himself be seduced by the Kingmaker into treason against his own brother, marrying the Earl's daughter and joining the rebellion that drove the monarch from his throne, dreaming, perhaps, that he might be made king himself. When the wheel turned and the king came back, this faithless brother turned his coat again, abandoning the Kingmaker and crawling back to the brother he had betrayed, and was forgiven, for the sovereign was merciful to his own blood. But a man who is betrayed once is never wholly trusted again, and the faithless brother could not keep still, but went on scheming and grumbling and overreaching, until at last he pushed even his patient brother too far, and was arrested, and condemned to death for his treasons. And here the war shows its strangest face, for the king could not quite bring himself to a public execution of his own brother, and so the thing was done in secret in the tower, and the rumour ran, and has never died, that the condemned brother was allowed to choose his own death and chose to be drowned in a great barrel of sweet wine. Whether it is true or not, the tale has clung to him for 500 years. A royal brother drowned in a butt of wine, and it stands as a fitting emblem of the whole war, in which brother destroyed brother, and the closest bonds of blood counted for nothing against the hunger for a crown. And the Kingmaker, master of England once more, went to the Tower of London, where the gentle old Lancastrian king had been kept a prisoner these long years, ever since his cause had been broken, and brought him out, blinking and bewildered, and set the crown back upon his head. It was one of the strangest sights of the whole strange war. The holy, gentle king, who had lost his wits and his crown and his liberty, led out of his prison and restored to a throne he had never wanted and could not hold, a puppet now in the hands of the very earl whose family had pulled him down, while the real power lay all with the Kingmaker. Spare a thought for the gentle Henry at the centre of it, for of all the figures in this story, his is perhaps the saddest. A holy and harmless man, broken on the wheel of a quarrel he never wanted and could not understand. He had never sought the crown. It had been put on his head in his cradle. He had no taste for war or power or any of the things men killed for. He wanted only to pray, to found his colleges, to do good and save his soul. In gentler times he might have been remembered as a good and a holy king, for his virtues were real, and they were the virtues of a private man rather than a ruler. He was genuinely devout, spending long hours at his prayers, simple in his dress and his habits, where other rulers loved display, merciful where others were harsh, shrinking from cruelty and bloodshed, troubled by the coarseness and the sin of the world around him. His great love was learning and the founding of places of study and worship, and he poured his heart and his treasure into the building of a noble college and a great chapel, endowing schools, dreaming of young men raised in piety and learning. And these foundations of his outlived all the wreck of his reign, and stand to this day, the gentle monarch's truest monument, lovelier by far than anything won by the warriors who pulled him down. He wished no man harm. He wanted only to do good, to be left in peace with his prayers and his books and his charities, and had he been born a younger son or a private gentleman, he might have lived a blessed and a blameless life. But he was born to a stolen crown and a quarrelsome nobility and the hardest inheritance in Christendom, and his very goodness, his gentleness, his want of all the hard, ruthless qualities a monarch of that age needed, became in him a fatal weakness, the door through which all the disaster came. There is no sadder figure in the whole story than this good, gentle man, too kind and too holy for his crown, broken on the wheel of a brutal age that had no place for his virtues, and destroyed in the end, precisely because he was too good to be a king. And for these gentle wishes, the world had repaid him with a lifetime of torment, the loss of his wits, the loss of his crown, years shut in a prison, and now this final indignity, dragged out of his cell, his mind half gone, and propped up once more upon a throne as the puppet of the men who had use of his name. He understood little of it, by all accounts, this last strange restoration, sitting bewildered in his royal robes, while the kingmaker ruled in his name, a holy ghost of a ruler haunting his own court. There was something almost blasphemous in it, the using of this good broken man as a mere counter in the game of power, and it could not last. For a throne built on so hollow a king was built on nothing at all. When the wheel turned again, as it was about to, there would be no mercy for the gentle king. For he had become too dangerous to leave alive and too useless to keep, and the men of blood would close his sad story in the dark of the tower. But for a few strange months he sat his throne again, the puppet king, the holy fool of the whole bloody tragedy. And the sight of him there was the strangest thing the long war ever showed. There is a gentle epilogue to his sad story that is worth the telling, for it shows how the people remembered him after all the cruelty was done. The gentle Henry, murdered in the dark of the tower, his cause extinguished, his lines stamped out, might have been forgotten, one more victim of the war's long slaughter. Instead, the common people, who had suffered under his weak rule, yet had never doubted his goodness, took the murdered king to their hearts after his death, and began to revere him almost as a saint. They remembered not the failed ruler, but the holy, harmless man, the ruler who had wanted only to pray and do good. And they came to believe that so gentle and so wronged a soul must surely be blessed in heaven. Pilgrims began to visit his tomb. Miracles were whispered of, healings and answered prayers laid at the dead monarch's name. His memory became a quiet cult of the gentle martyr king, the good man destroyed by a wicked age. Even the dynasty that had supplanted his house came, in time, to honour his memory and to press, though without success, for him to be made a saint in truth. It is a strange and a touching turn, that of all the great figures of the war, the warriors and the kingmakers and the conquerors, it was the gentle failure, the king too good and too weak for his throne, who was remembered with love and reverence by the people, his very unfitness to rule transfigured, in memory, into the holiness of a man too pure for the brutal world that broke him. The wheel had cast him as low as a sovereign could fall, murdered and forgotten in his prison. And then, in the memory of his people, it lifted him gently up again, the martyr king, the holy fool, beloved at last in death, as he had never been able to be in life. They called it the redemption, this restoration of the old monarch, and it lasted barely half a year, a brief unreal interval in which the wheel seemed to have turned all the way back to the beginning. Lancaster on the throne, York in exile, the kingmaker triumphant. But it was built on nothing, on a hollow king and a hated alliance and the fickle favour of a moment, and the man it had cast out was not a man to stay cast out for long. For the exiled Yorkist king was the finest soldier of his age, and he was not finished. He gathered what help he could abroad, and in the early spring he landed back in England with a small force, declaring at first, as wronged claimants always did, that he came only for his own duchy and not for the crown. The comeback he made that spring was one of the boldest strokes of his whole bold life, and it shows the steel and the daring beneath the golden charm. He landed in the north with only a few hundred men, into a country held by his enemies, his cause seemingly lost, his crown on another's head. And by sheer nerve and skill, he turned it all around in a matter of weeks. He gave out, at the first, the old useful lie that he wanted, only his rightful lands, not the throne. And on that pretense towns that would have barred a claimant to the crown, let him pass. And he gathered strength as he went, his old followers slipping in to join him, his army growing with every mile, until he was strong enough to throw off the pretense and declare for the crown outright. He moved with the speed that was his great gift in war, faster than his enemies could believe, marching south before they could combine against him, taking the capital, seizing the poor old puppet king, and then turning to smash his foes one by one before they could unite. In a single brilliant lightning campaign, he went from a landless exile with a few hundred men to the master of the kingdom, winning 2 immense battles within a few weeks and destroying both the kingmaker and the last Lancastrian army. It was a feat of arms and of will that few commanders in history could have matched, and it is the proof, if proof were needed, that for all his faults the Golden Sovereign was one of the truly great soldiers of the age. Never beaten in the field in all his life, and never more dangerous than when his cause seemed lost. But as he marched, the country came back to him, his old supporters rallying, his treacherous brother returning to his side, his army swelling, until he was strong enough to throw off the pretense and march on London and take it, and seize the poor gentle old king once more and reclaim his throne. And then he turned to destroy the men who had cast him out. The kingmaker came south to give battle, and the two armies met in a thick fog on a field near a town called Barnet, just north of London, and fought blind in the mist, and in the confusion the Lancastrian lines fell into disorder and turned upon each other, and the day went to the Yorkist king. The powerful Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, the man who had made kings and unmade them, the mightiest subject England had known, was caught in the rout and killed, cut down in the fog as he tried to reach his horse, and so ended. In a muddy field in the mist, the most powerful nobleman of the entire war, the maker of sovereigns undone, at last by the monarch he had made. The death of the kingmaker was a turning point in more than the war, for it marked, in a way, the end of an age. He had been the last and greatest of the overmighty subjects, the lords whose private wealth and power rivaled the crown's own, who could raise armies of their own and make and unmake monarchs, and his whole career was the perfect and the terrible flowering of that dangerous order. No subject before him had ever held such power. He had been, at his height, very nearly the master of England, the man who set kings on the throne and pulled them down again at his pleasure. The proof of how far the balance had tipped away from the crown and toward the mighty lords. And his fall, cut down in the mud of an ordinary field, abandoned by fortune at the last, was a kind of judgment on that whole order, a sign that the day of the overmighty subject was passing. The king who killed him, and the careful Tudor king who would come after, would set themselves to tame the great lords, to break their private armies and bring the crown's power back to the centre, so that never again would a subject grow mighty enough to make a monarch. In that sense, the kingmaker was the last of his kind, the final and the grandest example of the medieval overmighty lord. And his death in the fog at Barnet was the beginning of the end of the world that had made him. The wheel had lifted him higher than any subject had ever climbed. And it brought him down, at the last, into a nameless field, the maker of rulers undone by the king he had made, his vast power scattered, his powerful name passing into the long roll of the war's reversals. And on that very same day, by a bitter chance, the fierce Queen of Lancaster landed back in England from her long exile, with her son, the Lancastrian prince, now grown to manhood, come at last to fight for the crown, not knowing that her great ally was already dead and her cause already broken. She would not give up. She gathered the last Lancastrian strength in the west and marched to join her friends in Wales, and the Yorkist king, tireless, marched to cut her off, and caught her at last near a town called Tewkesbury. And there, in the final great battle of this long phase of the war, he destroyed the last army of the House of Lancaster utterly. The Lancastrian force was broken and slaughtered, and in the rout the young Lancastrian prince, the Queen's son, the boy for whose inheritance she had fought for 20 bloody years, was killed, cut down in the field or shortly after. And with him died the future of his house. The killing did not stop with the battle. Many of the beaten Lancastrian lords, fleeing the rout, took refuge in the great abbey beside the field, claiming the ancient protection of sanctuary, the holy refuge that no armed hand was supposed to violate. For a day or two it held, and then it was broken. The victors, their blood up and their patience with the old cause exhausted, went into the sacred ground and took the men they wanted, dragging the defeated lords from the very altar, and a few days later led them out to the block and struck off their heads. It was a violation of one of the deepest customs of the age, the breaking of sanctuary, the laying of armed hands on men under the protection of the church, and it shocked even that hardened generation, a sign of how far the long war had worn away the old restraints of religion and chivalry alike. Where once men had stood in awe of the holy refuge, now they breached it without a qualm to finish their enemies. The hunger to destroy the last of the rival house, overriding even the fear of sacrilege. It was of a piece with everything else in those final bloody days of the cause. The prince killed in the rout, the lords dragged from the altar, the old king soon to be murdered in his prison, the whole house of Lancaster being stamped out root and branch with a thoroughness that spared neither child, nor sanctuary, nor anointed king. The war had begun years before, with men too reverent to depose a king in open parliament. It had come now to dragging lords from the altar and murdering kings in the dark, and that descent, from reverence to ruthlessness, is the whole grim journey of the Wars of the Roses, written small. The fierce queen was taken prisoner, her army gone, her son dead, her cause in ruins, the long fierce fight of her life lost at last. And there remained only one thing for the Yorkist king to do to make his victory complete. One last Lancastrian life, standing between him and a secure throne. And that was the old and gentle Henry himself, the holy, harmless prisoner in the Tower. The night the victorious king returned to London, the captive monarch died in the Tower, and though it was given out that he had died of grief and melancholy at the destruction of his house, no one believed it then or since. For everyone knew that he had been murdered quietly in his prison, on the orders of the sovereign, who could not afford to leave him alive. The Tower of London stands at the dark heart of so much of this story that it deserves a word of its own. For again and again the war's grimmest deeds were done within its walls. It was the greatest fortress in the kingdom, a mighty ring of stone and battlement on the river's edge, raised by the conqueror centuries before to overawe the city. And it was many things at once: a royal palace, a stronghold, an armory, a treasury, and a prison. Kings stayed there in state before their crownings, in fine apartments hung with silk, and sovereigns and princes died there in the dark, quietly made away with when they had become inconvenient. The gentle old king was murdered within its walls, the two boy princes vanished within them. The faithless brother met his strange end there in his barrel of wine, and over the centuries before and after, a long procession of the great and the fallen passed through its gates to imprisonment or death. It was the place where the war's victors disposed of those they could not afford to keep alive. the silent stone stage on which the quiet murders were done, away from the eyes of the world, behind the thick walls in the dead of night. To the people of the city it was a thing of dread, the grey fortress by the river, where the great went in and did not come out, and its shadow lies across the whole story of the roses. The dark twin of all the bright banners and the open battles, the place where the war did its quietest and its cruelest work. And so, with the gentle old monarch dead and his son dead and his fierce queen, a broken captive, the house of Lancaster, the holders of the stolen crown, the cause of the red rose, was at last entirely extinguished, root and branch, and the House of York reigned over England, with no rival left alive to challenge it. The killing of the gentle old man in the Tower was the grimmest necessity of the victor's hard arithmetic, and it shows how far the war had stripped away the old reverence for the anointed king. A few years before, men had stood in appalled silence rather than depose a crowned king in Parliament. Now a crowned king was quietly put to death in his prison, and the realm hardly murmured, so cheap had royal blood become in the long grinding of the war. The young Lancastrian prince had died at Tewkesbury, the last hope of the male line. The old sovereign, with his son dead, was the last obstacle, and so long as he lived, he was a banner that the defeated might one day rally to, a living king for the cause of the Red Rose. And so, on the night the victorious king returned to the city, the gentle old king died in the Tower, and the tale that he had died of pure displeasure and melancholy fooled no one. For everyone understood that he had been murdered, the wholly harmless king done quietly to death, because his existence was inconvenient to the man who had won. It was the logical end of the war's whole brutal logic that a saint should be murdered for the crime of being a ruler, and with his death the House of Lancaster, which had held the stolen crown for 3 generations, was utterly extinguished in the male line, every claimant dead, the red rose cut down to the root. The House of York had won completely. There was no one left to fight. And in that very completeness, though no one could see it yet, lay the seed of the last and strangest turn of all, for a house with no enemies left outside itself will, in time, find its enemies within. The war, surely, was over. The White Rose had won. And for 12 years it held. For 12 years the tall golden king reigned in peace, and the kingdom healed, and the long war seemed to belong to the past. He had no rival left, no Lancastrian claimant to trouble him, and he settled into a prosperous middle age, grown heavy now with good living, fond of his food and his pleasures, but still shrewd, still strong, still master of his realm. He had 2 young sons to follow him and secure his line, and a court full of his queen's Woodville relations, grown rich and powerful, and a younger brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who had been loyal to him through everything, through exile and return and battle, and who ruled the north of England in his name, capably and well, the sovereign's strong right hand. But beneath the calm surface of those peaceful years, there ran a hidden fault, and it was the same fault that had cracked the realm open before, the deep division and distrust among the foremost men around the throne. The court had split, quietly, into camps that watched each other with suspicion, for the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, grown vast and powerful through 20 years of royal favour, had gathered around themselves the young heir, the elder of the king's 2 sons, who had been raised in their keeping and was bound to them by every tie. And ranged against them, distrusting them, was the old nobility, and above all, the monarch's own brother, who had no love for the upstart queen's relations, and feared what would happen if they ever controlled a young king in their own right. So long as the strong golden king lived, his sheer authority held the 2 camps in balance and kept the peace between them. But it all depended on him, on his life, on the firm hand that alone could master the rival factions. exactly as the whole realm had once depended on the strong kingship that the gentle sovereign could not provide. The peace was real, but it was personal, resting on one man's strength. And a peace that rests on one man's life is only ever one death away from ruin. When that strong king died, suddenly, in the prime of his life, leaving a boy heir caught between the grasping queen's family and the suspicious old nobility, the hidden fault would split wide open in an instant, and the kingdom that had healed so well would tear itself apart one last terrible time. It all seemed settled. The House of York secure for generations, the war a closed and bloody chapter. And then, with no warning at all, in the prime of his life, the tall golden king fell suddenly ill, and within a few days he was dead. His death was the hinge on which the last act of the whole tragedy swung, and its suddenness was everything. Had he lived another 10 years, his eldest son would have grown to manhood, come to the throne, a grown and capable king, mastered the rival factions as his father had. And the House of York might have ruled securely for generations, and the long war ended quietly with the Golden Edward's peaceful reign. Instead, he died at only 40, with no warning, his health undermined perhaps by the rich, indulgent living of his later years, struck down before his work was finished, before his heir was grown, before the peace he had built was made secure. And in dying so, he left the very thing the whole long war had shown to be most fatal. A boy king, a child of 12 caught between the warring factions of his father's court, with no strong hand to hold the realm, and no grown king to command the loyalty of the great. Everything the golden monarch had won, the crown secured, the realm at peace, the dynasty established, depended on his living long enough to see his son grown, and his sudden death tore it all open in an instant, undoing in a few days the work of 20 years. It is one of the great what might have beens of history, for had that strong heart beaten a decade longer, the Wars of the Roses might have ended there, in the Golden King's bed, with the House of York triumphant and secure. Instead, his death was the starting gun for the last and darkest act of all. The boy, the dark uncle, the children in the tower, and the final bloody turning of the wheel. He was only 40 years old, and his death was as sudden as a thunderclap, and it tore the healing kingdom open along all its old hidden seams in an instant. For the heir he left was a boy of 12, and a boy king, as all the long tragedy had already shown, was the most dangerous thing a kingdom could hold. What followed in the next few months is the darkest and most disputed passage of the entire war, and we may never know the whole truth of it, for it happened in shadows and behind closed doors. The dead king's brother, Richard of Gloucester, was named protector of the realm during the boy king's minority, the strong uncle to guide the child, exactly as the Duke of York had once been protector for gentle Henry. But the child was surrounded by his mother's family, the Woodvilles, who meant to rule through him themselves, and who feared and hated the royal uncle. And Richard, in his turn, feared and distrusted them. And Richard moved first, and moved hard. He seized the young king from the Woodvilles as the boy was brought to London, arrested and then put to death the Queen's brother and her son by her first marriage, and took the boy and his younger brother into his own keeping, lodging them in the royal apartments of the Tower of London to await the coronation. The younger of the two boys had not been with his brother at the first, for when the sovereign's death threw the court into terror, the boy's mother, the widowed queen, had snatched up her remaining children and fled with them into sanctuary, into the holy refuge of the great abbey at Westminster, where by the ancient law of the church no armed hand might reach. Sanctuary was one of the deepest customs of that age, a mark of how the church stood above even the quarrels of monarchs, for any man pursued by his enemies, even a traitor or a murderer, might flee to certain holy places and there be safe, untouchable, so long as he stayed within the sacred ground. And to drag a man out of sanctuary by force was a sacrilege that few dared. So the queen sat in the abbey with her children and her household goods piled around her, safe but trapped, while outside the man who had taken her son built his power. And in the end she was persuaded, by argument and by pressure and by the promise that the boy would be safe and would attend his brother's crowning, to give up her younger son out of the sanctuary, to send the little prince out of the one place that could protect him and into the keeping of the man who held his brother. She let him go, and the two boys were together at last in the tower, and she never saw either of them again. It is among the most heartbreaking moments of the whole story, the mother in sanctuary surrendering her last protected child on a promise. And it shows how even the holy refuge of the church could not, in the end, shield the innocent from the long reach of the war. And then, swiftly, the coronation did not happen. Instead, there came forth a claim that the dead king's marriage to his Woodville queen had never been lawful, that the two boys were therefore illegitimate, barred from the throne, and that the crown by right belonged to their uncle Richard, the last true son of the House of York. This was the other great weapon of the war, beside the sword, the war of words and claims and stories, by which each side strove to make its cause look lawful and its enemies look false. For no one in that age could simply seize a crown and admit that he held it by force alone. The whole reverence for kingship demanded that a king be lawful, rightful, the true heir, and so every usurpation had to be dressed in the clothes of right, justified by some argument of blood or law, or the unfitness of the man cast down. Claims were drawn up by lawyers, proclaimed in the marketplaces, spread by rumour and by the preaching of bought clerics, whole stories manufactured to blacken a rival and gild an usurper, tales of bastardy and illegitimacy and secret crimes, some of them true. Many of them invented, all of them weapons in the struggle for the one thing that mattered, the belief of the people that this man, and not that one, was the rightful king. The war was fought as fiercely in rumour and proclamation as on the field, for a claimant who could make the realm believe his cause was just had won half the battle before a sword was drawn. And a sovereign who lost the war of belief, who came to be seen as an usurper and a tyrant, was already half undone whatever his armies. And so the Wars of the Roses were not only a matter of marching and killing, but of storytelling, of the long struggle of rival houses, each to write itself as the hero and its enemy as the villain. And much of what later ages believed about the war and about its blackest figures came down from the winning side's version. The story told by those who held the field at the end. And Richard took it. He was crowned king. The third of that name, in place of his nephew, and the boy who had been king for a few brief weeks was set aside, declared a bastard, and lodged with his little brother in the tower. It all happened with astonishing speed, in the space of a few summer weeks, and to this day men argue over what was in the heart of the man who did it. Some have seen in it a long and cold ambition, a plan laid from the moment his brother died, a ruthless uncle who meant from the first to take the crown and who removed, one by one, with chilling efficiency, every obstacle between himself and the throne, the Queen's kinsmen, the loyal counsellors, the boys themselves. Others have seen a man driven by fear as much as ambition, a leading lord who genuinely believed, with reason, that if the Woodvilles got control of the boy king, they would destroy him as they had destroyed their enemies before, and who struck first to save his own life, and was then carried by the logic of his own actions, step by step, past the point of no return, until he had no choice but to take the crown or die. The truth is likely tangled, as the truth of men's hearts usually is, a mixture of ambition and fear and the terrible momentum of a deed once begun. But whatever was in his heart, the deed itself is plain. He took his young nephew's crown. declared the boy and his brother bastards on an argument few believed, and set himself on the throne in their place, and lodged the two children in the Tower of London, where kings kept those they wished to keep close. And then the speed and the certainty of the story falter, and we pass from what is known into the darkness. For what happened to the two boys after that is the one question this whole long history can never answer. And then the two boys vanished. Through that summer, they were seen less and less, playing in the tower gardens, glimpsed at the windows, and then not at all, and they were never, from that time, seen alive again. What became of the two boy princes, the sons of the tall golden king, is the great dark question at the heart of this whole history, and it has never been answered with certainty. They simply disappeared into the silence of the tower, and the belief spread through the kingdom then, and has never since been wholly shaken, that they were murdered there, smothered in their beds on the orders of the uncle who had taken their crown. Two children of the royal house done quietly to death, so that no one could ever raise them up against him. The Tower of London, where they vanished, was not only the grim fortress and prison of our imagining, but a working royal palace as well, with comfortable royal apartments where rulers stayed before their coronations, and it was in those apartments, at the first, that the two boys were lodged, not as prisoners, but as a monarch and a prince awaiting a crowning that never came. Through the early summer, they were seen at play in the gardens, shooting at the butts, glimpsed at the windows by the people of the city, two ordinary boys of 12 and 9 in the great fortress by the river, and then, by slow degrees, they were seen less, drawn deeper into the inner apartments, glimpsed more rarely, and then not at all, and a silence closed over them that has never been broken. No funeral was held, no bodies were shown, no word was ever given of their fate. They simply ceased, that summer, to be seen alive. And into that silence the whole kingdom poured its dread, certain that the boys had been quietly killed. Whether their uncle ordered it, or another hand did the deed, or whether some stranger truth lies buried that we will never know, the children were gone. And the manner of their going haunted the rest of the war, and has haunted the imagination of the kingdom ever since. There is no crueler image in all the long history of the roses than those two boys, king's sons, fading from the windows of the tower into the dark, and there is no clearer sign of how far the war had carried men from mercy that the realm could believe, without much surprise, that an uncle had murdered his brother's children for a crown. There are those who have argued his innocence, then and ever since, and the truth lies buried with the children. But the disappearance was a thing the country could not forgive, whoever had done it, for there is no act in all the long catalogue of the war's cruelties that struck so deep as the vanishing of those two boys, and from the moment they were lost, the new monarch, for all his crown, was a haunted and a hated man, and the loyalty of his subjects began, quietly, to drain away from him. It is one of the sadder ironies of the story that the king who took the crown by this dark road might, in another life, have been a good one. For he was no mere monster of the storybooks. In his years ruling the north for his brother, he had governed well and justly, a capable and diligent lord, respected and even loved in that hard country, a fair judge and a brave soldier and a careful administrator. And in his brief reign as king, he showed the same hand, passing good and useful laws, taking thought for the common people and the doing of justice, governing, in the ordinary business of kingship, with skill and care. Had he come to the throne by any other road, he might be remembered as a strong and an able king. But he came to it over the bodies of his brother's children, or under the unshakable suspicion of it, and that one dark deed swallowed all the rest, poisoning his whole reign at the root, turning his subjects against him, draining away the loyalty that a king must have, leaving him isolated and distrusted and exposed when his rival came at last. He had perhaps 2 years upon the throne, no more, before the wheel that had carried him up brought him down again on the field at Bosworth, and in that short haunted time he could never escape the shadow of the tower. He is the last of the war's great tragic figures, an able man destroyed by the means he used to climb, the final proof of the old hard truth that runs through the whole story, that the crown taken by blood is never safe, and that those who reach for it by such dark roads seldom hold it long, or rest easy while they do. He had reached the summit of the wheel, and the wheel, as it always did, began to turn. Now, with the house of Lancaster long extinguished, and the house of York turned to devouring itself, you might think there was no one left to challenge the new sovereign, no rival claimant anywhere in the land. And there very nearly was not. But there remained, across the sea, a single thin and unlikely thread of the old Lancastrian blood, a young man almost no one had heard of, living in exile in a foreign country. And around that slender thread the whole broken cause of Lancaster, and all the enemies the new king had made, now began to gather. His name was Henry Tudor, and his claim to the throne was faint indeed, for it came not through the main Lancastrian line, which was dead, but through a side branch, the descendants of an old love affair generations before. The children of a great duke and the woman he had loved outside his marriage, legitimized long ago, but barred, in the very document that made them lawful, from any claim to the crown. Through that barred and bastard-born branch, the Beauforts, the blood of old Lancaster, came down at last to this one young exile, carried to him by his formidable mother, a small, determined woman named Margaret Beaufort, who had poured her whole life into the cause of her only son. She is one of the most remarkable figures in the whole story, this mother, and her son owed her his crown as surely as he owed it to any battle. She had borne him when she was scarcely more than a child herself, a girl of 13, widowed and a mother in the same dreadful season, and she had spent the rest of her long life in single-minded devotion to his cause, scheming and waiting and working through all the turns of the war to bring her boy at last to the throne. Through the years of York's triumph, she had kept her head down and bided her time, married to powerful men, placing herself close to the centre of things, watching and planning, never abandoning the impossible dream that her son, that thin and unlikely thread of Lancastrian blood, might one day be king. And when the moment came, when the new ruler's cruelty to the princes had turned the realm against him, it was she, more than anyone, who wove the conspiracy that would bring her son home. Reaching out in secret to the queen of the murdered prince's mother, arranging the marriage that would join their causes, knitting together the broken enemies of the ruler into a single web aimed at the throne. Her son was the claimant, but she was the architect, the patient, relentless mother who had given her whole life to this one end. And when at last the crown was won and set upon his head, it was the fruit of her lifetime of devotion as much as of any sword. The blood of old Lancaster, damned and barred and driven into exile, came back to the throne at the last, through a mother's unbreakable will. And the dynasty that followed owed its very existence to the small, determined woman who had never, through all the long dark years, given up on her son. And she was not alone, for if the war was fought in the field by men, it was sustained and shaped, behind the scenes, by a remarkable company of formidable women, the great ladies of the warring houses, who played a part in it far larger than the chronicles of battles would suggest. The fighting men were forever marching and dying, captured and exiled and killed, and in their absence it fell again and again to their wives and mothers and daughters to hold the family's lands, to defend its castles, to manage its vast affairs, to keep its cause alive through the long stretches when its men were gone. These were not the meek and ornamental ladies of the storybooks, but capable and determined women, raised to run vast households and bred to the hard business of a noble family's survival. And when the men fell, they stepped into the breach, negotiating with sovereigns, raising money, smuggling letters, sheltering heirs, plotting and waiting and enduring. The fierce queen who led armies, the proud Neville matriarch who bore the House of York, its sons and outlived most of them, the patient mother who schemed a lifetime to make her boy a ruler, the widowed queen who took her children into sanctuary. These were the women at the heart of the war, and the cause of each house rested as much on their will and their wit as on any sword. It is one of the things the bare tale of battles misses, that beneath the marching and the fighting there ran this whole hidden war of formidable women, holding the houses together while the men tore them apart. And that more than one turn of the whole great story was decided not on a field, but by the patient determination of a great lady who would not let her family's cause die. It was the thinnest claim imaginable, a stream of royal blood that the law itself had damned. But when the rightful monarchs are all dead or murdered, even the thinnest thread will serve, and to the many men who now hated the new monarch, who could not forgive the vanished boys in the tower, the obscure young exile across the sea became, suddenly, the hope of the kingdom. For the new sovereign's hard road to the throne had left him friendless, and his enemies, the old supporters of the dead Golden King, the men appalled by the fate of the princes, the eminent Woodville faction, and the last loyal Lancastrians, all of them began to look across the sea to Henry Tudor and to plot to bring him home. And to bind the broken halves of the kingdom together, a marriage was promised, the cleverest stroke of the whole long war, that if the young exile could win the crown, he would marry the eldest daughter of the dead Golden King, the heiress of the House of York, and so join the two warring roses, red and white, in a single line, and end the quarrel forever by uniting the very blood that had been fighting over it for 30 years. With that promise, the cause caught fire. And so the young man who had spent his whole life in exile, who had never commanded an army or fought a battle, gathered what force he could and sailed for England to stake everything on a single throw, to win a kingdom or to die, against an anointed king and a hardened soldier on his own ground. It was a reckless, desperate venture, but the kingdom was ready to fall to him, and many who marched under the king's banner had no intention of fighting for him. When the moment came, they met at last on a field in the Midlands, near a town called Bosworth, and there the long war was decided. The sovereign had the larger army and the high ground and the right, and he was the more experienced soldier by far. But his host was riddled with treachery, great lords who had come to the field with their thousands of men and who sat their horses, waiting, watching to see which way the day would go before they would commit themselves to either side. And when the battle was joined, and the king saw his enemy exposed for a moment, he did a thing of reckless courage, charging with his household knights straight across the field to cut down the young pretender himself and end it in a single stroke. He almost reached him. He cut down the pretender's standard-bearer, came within a sword's length of the man who would take his crown. And in that moment, the waiting lords made their choice, and threw their fresh thousands not behind their king, but against him. And the monarch was surrounded, and pulled down, and killed, fighting to the last. The only English king to die in battle in all those long centuries, cut down in the press at the very edge of victory. What was done with his body afterward was the final indignity of a war that had by then lost its reverence for kings. The dead king, the last of his ancient royal line, was stripped of his armour and his fine clothes, slung naked across the back of a horse like a carcass, and carried from the field to the nearest town, where his broken body was put on public show for some days, so that all might see that the king was truly dead, and no pretender could later rise in his name. Then he was buried, without ceremony and without honour, in a humble grave in a friar's church. The sovereign who had worn the crown of England laid in the ground like a pauper, his resting place soon half forgotten. It was a grim and a shameful end for an anointed king, however he had come by his crown, and it tells you how far the long war had carried England from the old reverence for the sacred person of the king. The reverence that had once made men stand in appalled silence, rather than depose a crowned king in Parliament. By the end of the Wars of the Roses, a dead king could be stripped and slung over a horse and buried in a ditch, and the kingdom hardly blinked. So cheap had royal blood and royal dignity become in the long grinding of the quarrel. And so the last of the old royal house went into the ground, unhonoured, on the field where the war was decided, and over his unmarked grave there rose the new dynasty, and the long age of the medieval rulers, with all its glory and all its blood, came quietly to its end. They found his crown afterward, it was said, fallen in the field, and they took it and set it upon the head of the young exile, there on the bloody ground, and proclaimed him King, the 7th Henry, the first king of the House of Tudor. There is a bleak justice in the way the last Yorkist king died, for he died as the whole war had taught men to die, betrayed at the crucial moment by those who should have stood with him. He was no coward, whatever else may be said of him, and no fool in war. He had the larger army and the better position and the greater experience, and his desperate charge at the end, cutting his way across the field to come within a sword's length of his rival, was an act of furious courage that nearly won the day outright. But the war had hollowed out the very thing that a king depended on, the loyalty of his mighty lords, and on that field the most powerful of them sat their horses and watched, waiting to see which way fortune would lean before they would risk their men, and when they saw their king exposed and his charge faltering, they threw their fresh thousands against him rather than for him, and he was pulled down and killed in the press. It was the war's last and bitterest lesson in the cost of broken loyalty that an anointed king, brave and able, could be cut down on his own field by the treachery of the lords who had sworn to follow him, and that the crown by now was a thing that changed heads, not by right or by God's will, but by the cold calculation of who would win. They found the fallen crown in the field, the old story says, and set it on the head of the exile who had never before led an army, and the long war was decided, and a wholly new dynasty rose over England out of the blood and the betrayal of that Midland field. The long war of the Roses, the 30 years of cousin slaughter, was over at last, ended on a Midland field by a thin thread of bastard blood and the treachery of waiting lords, and a new dynasty, sprung from the union that was to come, rose over the exhausted kingdom. It is worth standing back for a moment to see where this war sits in the long story of England, for it falls at one of the crucial hinges of that story. The very end of the medieval world and the beginning of something new. For centuries before it, England had been ruled in the medieval way by warrior monarchs at the head of a powerful feudal nobility. The crown forever balanced against the power of the mighty lords, the whole realm held together by the personal bonds of loyalty and service and blood that we have watched at work throughout this tale. The Wars of the Roses were, in a sense, the final and most terrible flowering of that old order. The overmighty nobility and their private armies tearing the kingdom apart in the way that such an order always risked. And at the same time, they were its death, for the slaughter of the great and the rise of the careful new king broke the power of that old feudal nobility forever. What came after was a different kind of kingship, stronger, more centred, less at the mercy of the powerful lords, the beginning of the road that led away from the medieval world toward the modern one. So this war stands as a kind of doorway between two ages, the last great convulsion of medieval England and the birth pangs of the dynasty that would carry the kingdom into a new and famous age. The men who fought it did not know they stood at such a hinge of history. They thought only of their families and their claims and their feuds. But looking back across 500 years, we can see that in their long and bloody quarrel, an old world was dying and a new one being born, and that the Wars of the Roses were not only the end of a story, but the beginning of one. The new monarch kept his promise and married the daughter of the House of York. The white rose wedded to the red, and from their union came a new emblem, a single rose of red and white together, the rose of the Tudors, the sign that the two warring houses were joined at last in one blood and one line. The bride who joined the roses deserves to be remembered, for in her person the whole long quarrel found its healing. She was the eldest daughter of the Golden Sovereign and his Woodville Queen, the sister of the two boys who had vanished in the Tower, a princess of the House of York who had lived through the fall of her own family, the loss of her brothers, the seizure of her uncle, the whole dark turning of the war's last act. And now she was made the bride of the man who had won the crown, and the carrier, in her royal blood, of all the Yorkist claim, so that her marriage joined the right of York to the right of Lancaster, and the children she bore would unite in themselves the two bloods that had warred for 30 years. She was, by all accounts, gentle and gracious, and much loved, a healing presence after the storms, and her marriage was a true joining. The rival claims made one not by the destruction of either house, but by their union in her and in her children. From her and her husband sprang the new dynasty, and the famous monarchs who would follow carried in their veins the mingled blood of York and Lancaster, the red rose and the white grown together, at last into one. It was the ending the exhausted kingdom had longed for, embodied in this one young woman, the White Princess, who became the mother of a new royal line, and in whom the long war of the roses was, at the last, not won or lost, but reconciled and laid to rest. It was the healing the exhausted kingdom craved. The bitter quarrel ended, not by the victory of one house over the other, but by their marriage. The children of this union carrying in their veins the right of both Lancaster and York, so that no one could ever again raise one rose against the other without warring against himself. The joining of the roses was a stroke of genius, and the new king understood its power and used it to the full, for he made the united rose, the red and the white, woven into a single bloom, the badge of his whole reign, stamped on his buildings and his coins and his banners, a constant visible reminder to the kingdom that the long quarrel was over and the two houses were now one. It was a piece of statecraft as much as a symbol, the careful crafting of a story the realm could believe in, that the bloody chaos of the roses had been resolved at last into harmony, that the new dynasty was not the triumph of one faction, but the reconciliation of all, the natural and rightful end of the whole grim tragedy. And in the main it worked. The kingdom, exhausted by 30 years of slaughter, longing above all for peace and order, embraced the story and the dynasty that told it, and rallied to the new ruler as the bringer of an end to the bloodshed. There would be trouble still, pretenders and plots, and the last spasms of the old struggle, and the new monarch never for a moment let down his watchful guard. But the mighty war was truly over, and the symbol of the united rose, the red and white together, became the sign of its ending, the emblem of a kingdom that had torn itself half to pieces over the colour of a flower and had healed at last by joining the two colours into one. It is the rose we still think of when we think of that royal house, and it was born of the deepest wish of an exhausted people that the long nightmare of the cousins' war should be over, and the wheel, for a while at least, come to rest. The new king was a cautious, careful, watchful man, hardened by his long exile, and he set about binding up the wounds of the realm with a patient and an iron hand, taming the mighty lords whose private armies had made the war possible, filling his treasury, securing his throne, founding the dynasty that would rule England through its most famous age and give it some of the most celebrated monarchs in all its history. He understood, better than anyone, the deep cause of the long war, and he set himself, patiently and relentlessly, to cut it out at the root. The war had been made possible by the overmighty subjects, the great lords with their private armies of liveried retainers, who had grown stronger than the crown and turned their strength against it. And so the new sovereign made it his life's work to break that private power and pull it back to the throne. He clamped down hard on the keeping of private armies, on the giving of livery and maintenance, forbidding the powerful lords to gather the followings that had made them dangerous. He bound the nobility to him with fearsome bonds and fines, holding their wealth and their futures hostage to their loyalty, so that a lord who stepped out of line faced ruin. He filled his treasury until he no longer depended on anyone, and he kept his watchful eye on every corner of his realm, trusting no one, taking no chances, the very opposite of the gentle Henry, whose weakness had let the war begin. It was not a glorious reign, this careful Tudor kingship, but it was a healing one, for by breaking the power of the foremost lords, he made it impossible for the war ever to begin again, drawing the teeth of the whole dangerous order that had torn the kingdom apart. The age of the overmighty subject, of the private army and the king-making earl, was over, and a new age of strong central kingship was beginning, and in that change, more than in any battle, lay the true and final end of the Wars of the Roses. The careful king had not only won the crown, he had remade the kingdom so that no one could ever again do to a sovereign what had been done over and over through all the long years of the Roses. There were a few last spasms of the old struggle. Pretenders who rose, claiming to be one or other of the lost Yorkist princes, come back from the dead. Shadows of the vanished boys haunting the new king's reign, and they had to be put down, one after another, before the realm was truly quiet. These pretenders were the strange and haunting aftershocks of the war, and they show how the unanswered question of the vanished boys gnawed at the kingdom for years. Because no bodies had ever been shown, because no one knew for certain that the princes were dead, the door stood open for impostors to walk through. Young men coached and dressed and put forward by the new ruler's enemies, each claiming to be one of the lost children of the House of York, miraculously escaped from the tower and come to claim his throne. One such youth, a boy of humble birth trained to play the part of a Yorkist prince, was crowned by rebels and led an army against the new monarch before he was beaten, and in a stroke of contempt, spared and set to work as a turnspit in the royal kitchens. Another, more dangerous, a handsome young man who claimed for years to be the younger of the two lost princes himself, returned from the dead, won the backing of foreign sovereigns and gathered support across Europe, and troubled the new sovereign for the better part of a decade before he too was taken and at the last put to death. They came to nothing in the end, these ghosts of the murdered boys, but the fact that they could rise at all, that men would follow a stranger because he might be a dead prince, tells you how raw the wound of the vanishing still was, and how shaky, for all the union of the Roses, the new dynasty's hold at first remained. Only when the last pretender was gone, and the last sprig of the old royal house dealt with, could the new king at last feel his throne secure. The final shadows of the long war chased away, but the great war was done. The wheel had come to rest. And out of all the blood and the slaughter, out of 30 years of cousins killing cousins, there had come at last a new and a lasting peace, and a new royal house, and the long age of the medieval monarchs was over. So that, in the bare bones of it, is what happened. But you did not come here only for the bones, for the battles and the kings and the turning of the crown. And now, with the war run all the way through, let us turn to the deeper question, the one the bare story cannot answer, which is what it was really like to be alive in England in those 30 years, to live through the time of the Roses. For we must not imagine, behind all the drama of the leading names a kingdom in constant flames. For it was not. The war was not a steady thing, but a series of short, sharp convulsions. A battle here, a campaign there, separated by long stretches of uneasy peace. And for much of the time, in much of the country, ordinary life went on. The fields ploughed, and the harvests gathered, and the markets held. The great mass of the common people, watching the quarrels of their betters from a wary distance, and praying only to be left alone. But for those near the top, for the great families whose fortunes rode upon the war, there was a particular torment in the way it came and went, the never knowing, from one year to the next, who would be king, or whether one's own head would still sit upon one's shoulders. A man might be high in favour one season, an eminent lord of the ruling house, and an attainted traitor the next, his lands forfeit, his life in danger, all by the turning of a single battle far away. Loyalties had to be guessed and gambled on, for to back the wrong side was ruin. And yet which side was the right one might change overnight with the fortunes of war, so that the mighty men of the realm lived in a constant, uneasy reckoning, watching the wheel, trimming their loyalties, trying to read the unreadable future and stay on the winning side. Some grew skilled at it, changing their coats as often as the crown changed heads, surviving every turn by never committing too soon. Others held to one cause through everything and rose or fell with it. But all of them lived under the shadow of the war's terrible uncertainty, the knowledge that everything they had, their lands, their titles, their lives, hung upon a thread that any battle might cut, and that the wheel which had lifted them might at any moment begin to turn. It was a way of living that bred both great loyalty and great treachery, that made some men heroes and others turncoats. And it is a part of what it was really like to spend 30 years never knowing, when you lay down at night, whether you would wake to find your king still king, and yourself still safe. For the ordinary people of England, the war was something that happened above their heads, and yet could, at any moment, come crashing down into their lives. And their experience of it was a strange mixture of distance and sudden terror. Most of the time, in most places, life went on much as it always had. The farmer in his field caring little whether York or Lancaster sat the throne. The work of the seasons going forward, the markets held, the children born and the dead buried, the bitter quarrel of the lords, a distant rumour. The common people had little stake in which great family won. For one royal master was much like another to a man who would plough the same field and pay the same dues whoever wore the crown. And they wanted, above all, only to be left in peace. But when an army came through, the distance vanished in an instant, for armies in that age fed themselves off the country they passed through, taking food and fodder and horses, and the passage of a host could strip a district bare. And worse came when the fighting was near, the looting and the burning and the killing that war brings to the places it touches. A village in the path of a campaign might be ruined, its stores taken, its men pressed to fight, its peace shattered, while a village a few miles off the line of march might hardly know the war was on. And there was the deeper cost too, the taxes that paid for it all, the disorder that crept in when the powerful lords were too busy fighting to keep the monarch's peace, the lawlessness that flourished in a kingdom whose rulers were at war. The common people did not, in the main, make this war, or fight it, or care who won it, but they paid for it in money and fear and sometimes in blood. The great mass of the kingdom bearing on its patient back the cost of the quarrels of the few. The war was above all a war of the mighty families, a quarrel at the very top of the world, and it was the nobility, far more than the common people, who paid for it in blood. For the strange and terrible toll of this war fell hardest upon the highest, upon the lords and the princes and the ancient houses, who were killed in the battles and executed after them in a slaughter of the great, such as England had never seen. whole noble families cut down, ancient titles extinguished. The proud old aristocracy of the realm, thinning and dying across the generation of the war until, by the end, it had half destroyed itself, and a new king could rise over a nobility too bled and too broken to stand in his way. The manner of this slaughter of the great deserves a word, for it marked a darkening of the war as it went on. In the early days, something of the old chivalry held, the notion that a captured lord was a prize to be ransomed, not a man to be killed, and that the quarrels of princes should spare the common soldier. But as the blood feuds deepened and the hatreds grew, that restraint fell away, and the war turned to the deliberate destruction of the enemy's leaders. After the later battles, it became the custom to hunt down the great men of the beaten side and put them to death, not in the heat of the fighting, but cold afterward. Led out to the block in the market square of whatever town the victor held, their heads struck off and their bodies given to their families or set up as a warning. And to the killing of the body was added the killing of the line by the grim instrument of attainder, a sentence passed in Parliament by which a condemned man was declared corrupt in his very blood, his titles destroyed, his lands seized, his children disinherited, his whole family cast down from greatness into nothing at a stroke. Battle, block, and attainder together did their work across the long years, and the toll upon the highest families of the realm was staggering. A whole class thinned and broken, ancient houses snuffed out. The proud lords who had begun the war as the mightiest men in England reduced, branch by branch, to ruin and to dust. It was the strangest feature of this strangest of wars that it fell hardest not upon the poor, but upon the great, devouring the very nobility that waged it, until there was scarcely enough of the old lords left standing to trouble the careful new king who rose at the end over their graves. And for those caught up in it, the mighty ones whose story we have followed, what it was really like was to live always upon the turning wheel, to know that no height was safe and no fall was final, that fortune might lift you in a season from exile to a throne and cast you down again as quickly into the mud and the blood. The wheel of fortune was not merely a figure of speech to the men and women of that age, but one of the deepest images by which they understood the world, and it is worth dwelling on, for it is the truest key to the whole story. They pictured fortune as a great blind wheel, forever turning, with rulers and great ones clinging to its rim, some rising toward the top in glory, some at the summit in their pride, some falling, some crushed beneath at the bottom, and the wheel never resting, so that the man who was king today might be in the dust tomorrow, and the man in the dust might rise, and no one, however high, could ever count himself safe from the turning. It was a vision, born of exactly the kind of world this war revealed, a world without security, where the highest might fall furthest and fastest, where fortune lifted and cast down with no regard for merit or right, where the only certainty was change. And no chapter of history ever illustrated that grim old image more perfectly than the Wars of the Roses, in which we watch the wheel turn over and over, lifting York and casting him down, lifting the Sun King and casting him into exile and lifting him back, lifting the Kingmaker to the mastery of the realm and dashing him into a foggy field, lifting the gentle monarch and breaking him, lifting Lancaster and York and Tudor, each in their turn. To live through it for the great was to feel the wheel forever beneath you, to know that no triumph was final and no disaster was the end, to win everything and lose it in a season. And it taught the proudest people in England the oldest and hardest lesson there is, that fortune gives nothing it will not in time take back, and that those who climb highest have the furthest to fall. Think of how many lives in this story ran that terrible course. The Duke of York, a heartbeat from the crown, dead in a winter field with a paper crown on his severed head. The Kingmaker, the mightiest subject in the land, the maker of kings, cut down in a fog in a nameless field. The fierce queen, who fought for 20 years for her husband and her son, and lost her cause, her crown, her son, and her husband, and ended a broken captive, ransomed home to die, in poverty, in the country of her birth. Hers may be the most complete tragedy of them all, when you set the end of her life against the fire of its beginning. She had come to England, a proud young princess, to be its queen, and she had spent the whole of her womanhood in a desperate fight for her husband's crown and her son's birthright, leading armies, forging alliances, refusing through defeat after defeat to give up the cause, the fiercest and most relentless champion her adopted house ever had. And it had all come to nothing. On a single dreadful day, she lost it all, her army destroyed, her only son killed in the rout, the boy for whose inheritance she had fought for 20 years, and with him every hope and every reason for the long fight. Her husband was murdered within weeks. Her cause was extinguished, and she herself, the Wolf Queen who had terrified half of England, was led away a prisoner, her spirit at last broken by the killing of her son, kept in captivity for years until she was ransomed at a low price by the ruler of her native France, and sent home a defeated and impoverished widow, to live out her last years in obscurity and want in the country she had left as a hopeful girl. She died there, far from the kingdom she had fought so hard to hold, with nothing left of all she had struggled for. Her husband and her son and her cause all gone before her into the dark. There is no fall in all the long war steeper than hers. From the Queen of England, leading armies to the broken pauper, dying forgotten in a foreign land. And no clearer proof of the cruelty of the wheel she had ridden so high and so hard. The gentle monarch, who never wanted any of it, who lost his wits and his crown and his liberty and at last his life, murdered in the dark of the tower. The two boy princes, who walked into the tower one summer and were never seen again. This was what the war was really like, beneath all the banners and the glory, a long lesson in the cruelty of fortune and the terrible price of crowns, taught in blood to the proudest people in the kingdom, that those who reach for thrones must be ready to pay for them with everything they have and everyone they love, and that the wheel which lifts them up will soon or late come round again and bring them down. And there is one last hard truth folded into the heart of it, which is that there was never, in all the long quarrel, a clear right and wrong, a true king and an usurper plain for all to see. That was the deepest curse of the whole war, the thing that made it so hard to end, that both houses had a real claim. Both could trace their blood back to the sons of the old conqueror king. Both could argue, with reason and with lawyers, that the crown was theirs by right. The first theft, 2 generations back, had so tangled the line of succession that the question of who ought truly to be king could never afterward be answered cleanly. And so each side fought in the honest belief that it was the rightful one and its enemy, the traitor, and each could point to law and blood and God to prove it. There was no villain and no hero, only cousins with rival claims, each certain of his right, each ready to kill and die for it, and that is part of why the war ground on so long and so bitterly. For it could not be settled by any appeal to a right that all would own, only by the sword. And the sword settles nothing for long. It took, in the end, not the victory of one claim over the other, but the joining of the two, the marriage that married the rival bloods into one, to close the question at last. For only when the two claims became one could the killing finally stop. The Wars of the Roses were not a struggle of good against evil, but a tragedy of two rights at war, and there is no sadder kind of war than that, where every man believes himself just. And the blood that is shed by cousins, each certain that God and the law are on his side. And yet, for all its cruelty, There is a reason we are still telling this story 500 years on, lying in the dark and letting it carry us towards sleep. And it is not only for the blood. It is because it is, in the end, one of the greatest stories there is, a story of such reversal and such daring and such heartbreak that no teller of tales has ever bettered it. Full of figures who stand as large now as they did then. The golden warrior king, the wolf queen who would not yield, the earl who made and unmade crowns, the gentle holy king, too good for his throne, the lost children in the tower. The kingdoms and the crowns they fought for are long gone, dust these many centuries, and the powerful houses of Lancaster and York are only names now, carved on old tombs in cold churches. But the story has outlasted all of them, the whole long turning tragedy of the roses, and it runs on still, in the memory of a kingdom, and in the older, deeper memory of all the tales we tell about power and longing, and the terrible cost of the crown. For the war did not end when the fighting stopped, but lived on, and lives on yet, in the imagination of the people who came after, who could not let so vast and terrible a story go. The dynasty that rose at the end made the tale its own, shaping it into a great drama of order restored, of a long nightmare of chaos and bloodshed, ended at last by the coming of the new royal house, the union of the roses healing the wounded land. The poets and the players of later ages took it up and made of it some of the most famous stories ever told upon a stage, the gentle king and the fierce queen, the king-making earl, the golden warrior, the dark uncle and the children in the tower, figures grown larger than life, walking still through the memory of the kingdom. And beneath the particular tales there lived on the deeper thing, the great human story, the war embodied, of ambition and loyalty and betrayal, of fortune's wheel and the price of crowns, of families torn apart by the hunger for power. A story so true to the oldest patterns of the human heart that it has never grown old and never will. That is why we are here, after all, lying in the dark 500 years later, letting this old story carry us towards sleep, because it is one of the great stories, true and terrible and unforgettable. And because in the rise and fall of those long-dead sovereigns and queens we hear, however faintly, something about ourselves, about wanting and losing, and the turning of the wheel beneath us all. It is a story worth remembering on a quiet night, when the wheel of our own small fortunes has stopped for a while and let us rest. If these long nights and these old stories are something you would like to find your way back to, you are very welcome to stay a while in this company, and to let this be a place you return to when the dark comes early and sleep is slow in coming. There is no need to do anything at all, not now. There is only the dark and the warmth and the long story behind you now, the roses and the crowns and the turning wheel all growing soft and far away, the great monarchs and the fierce queen and the lost children sinking gently down into the deep well of the past where they belong, while you, here, now, safe and warm and far from all of it, let go of the day at last, and drift and sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.